A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
When I was a kid, I would embate during classes, but not for the reasons you might think. It was never about the pleasure, and I'm ashamed to admit it was more like a self-defense mechanism against the strange sensation that came over me in that classroom every time the clock struck 3. It started innocently enough in middle school. I was a bright kid, always eager to learn, but something about my science teacher, Mr. Jenkins, sent chills down my spine. I was convinced he had secrets hidden in his thick glasses and patchy beard, something dark that lurked behind the bulging eyes that stared too long at the blackboard. The more I noticed it, the more I realized something strange happened at that hour. Students would get drowsy, and while some would nod off, I would feel a strange heat creeping up my spine, urging me to escape. One day, as the clock struck 3, I caught a glimpse of Mr. Jenkins, his fingers twitching like they were attached to marionette strings, and I sank deeper into my desk, my pulse racing. I never planned to do what I did next. My fingers grazed my leg and, suddenly, everything blurred around me, a fog settling in as I slipped into a trance, desperately trying to drown out the panic that swelled within. The act, I thought, would numb me while I watched the sinister shadows dance around my classroom, flickering in and out of focus. It was on a day like this, with the sun dipping low, when I felt a cold hand clench my shoulder, and the realization that it wasn't just my imagination roared back, it was real, and Mr. Jenkins was watching. I froze, caught in my shameful act, and when I turned, I saw him standing there, eyes wide but devoid of any warmth, the pupils dilating like black holes, pulling me into an abyss. I could see the veins pulsing at his temples as he leaned closer, whispering things I couldn't understand, but I felt the essence of my childhood fears manifest behind him, shadows of envy and rage brewing like storm clouds. The other kids in the room appeared oblivious, mouths agape at the chalkboard, but I heard distinct whispers. They echoed around me, each one a marker of isolation. Mr. Jenkins, however, claimed me as his puppet, and he lured out something ugly within my psyche. The bell rang, but the other students remained still. They had been suspended in that moment, like flies caught in amber, and I felt the oppressive air close in around us. I tried to escape the intrusive thoughts, trapping them deep within myself until they seeped out uncontrollably, creating a rift between reality and the terrors lurking in the edges of my mind. I thought about seeking help, but how would I explain that I was being haunted by a man who spoke in riddles that only I could hear? Instead, I started to act out during class, masking my anxiety with what I did to myself, trying to push the darkness back, but it never fully receded. Nightmares followed me home, visions of Mr. Jenkins morphing into grotesque forms, shadows climbing the walls, sinister sounds echoing from behind closed doors, and sleep dwindled to half-hearted attempts of escape. Then came the day I finally found the courage to speak to my parents, but all they said was that the transition to high school would help, that I wouldn't have to deal with Mr. Jenkins anymore, and in a fit of desperation, I lashed out the only way I knew how, creating elaborate lies. I told them Mr. Jenkins was poisoning my mind, filling it with corrosive thoughts, but all they saw was a kid being ridiculous. Finally, I transferred schools, thinking I could outrun the darkness, but once absorbed into the new hallways, I realized the monsters were still there, following in the guise of familiar figures and even familiar teachers. I still found myself acting out to numb the creeping dread as the clock struck 3 in my next class, mimicking my past to gain control over the irrational fear lurking behind pedagogic smiles. It became a cycle, fated never to end, and though I grew older, trying to fit the pieces into something manageable, I realized I carried the weight of my past with me like a shackle. I learned to blend in, casting frantic glances toward the door as if it held the key to salvation. I became adept at wearing masks and lying to myself, yet every time I let my guard down, I could feel the cold fingers of dread grazing my neck, reminding me of what I fled from and the realization that I could never truly sever the ties with those hidden figures in the shadows. They would always loom, strings of dread intertwining with my heartbeat, and I could no longer distinguish my reality from the surreal. I thought I could escape if I were more vigilant, but the truth hit hardest as I sat alone at my desk one fateful afternoon. The shadows weren't bound to classrooms or teachers, they were within me, growing stronger, always attending my secret classes, haunting my thoughts with lessons I could never unlearn. The weight of my fears became too heavy to bear, and so, I resigned myself to the dark, shifting my thoughts back to those innocent days of trembling anticipation, hoping the next definition of freedom would come from the authority I created within my own mind, the one I held accountable for every betrayal I could see. But it was just a cruel illusion. With every instance of audacity in my new life, I could feel the hauntings morphing. One day they'd call for me again, waiting patiently for the moment when the classroom lights flickered, and the clock struck 3. The first time it happened, I dismissed it as fatigue, an odd glitch in my routine, maybe. It was a Tuesday night, the kind when the world outside my window seemed to retain an unsettling stillness, like a predator waiting to pounce on its prey. As I huddled on my couch, scrolling through my social media feeds, I noticed something strange, the perfectly timed ads that seemed to know my thoughts, the offhand comments from friends and strangers alike that echoed my innermost fears. I shrugged it off and turned off my phone, only to feel the familiar buzz of an incoming notification. The ground shook, not in earthquakes, but in an unnerving resonance within my ribs, vibrating right to where I was seated. I peeked out the window, but the streets looked the same, silent and cozy beneath the streetlights. Days turned into weeks, and the peculiarities piled up like snowdrifts on my doorstep, bright red cars passing by only to vanish as if erased from existence, the sound of laughter from children that never seemed to have a source, bleary faces of passers-by that all wore expressions of shared secret knowledge that I wasn't privy to. I began to feel like I was an extra in a film I didn't understand, every pedestrian an actor rehearsing a script long before I arrived on the set. One night, as the paranoia unfurled its icy tendrils around my sanity, I overheard two men talking on the street as I stepped out for some fresh air. They looked generic, all nondescript jackets and ball caps, but what chilled my blood was their conversation. It sounded like they were discussing me. "Did you see how he looked at the camera?" one said. "He's questioning the code. We can't let him find out." My heart raced as goosebumps erupted on my skin. I wanted to shout at them, to run, to hide. Instead, I slipped back into my house, locking the door with trembling hands, the edges of my vision swimming in panic. It wasn't long before reality started to chip away at its borders. I would be at a coffee shop, and the same barista would serve me every day at the same hour, yet each day, she'd say something slightly different. "Here you go. Your usual." One day, "And are you trying something new today?" The next, despite my order never changing. I wondered if they were all watching me, all playing me like a game character, feeding on my confusion. I sought solace in the digital world, perhaps desperately thinking that if this was some program or simulation, I could hack some control back. I downloaded every conspiracy theory forum I could find, drowning my mind in the chilling possibilities. A string of late-night rabbit holes led me to discussions of the realities scientists spoke about, of simulations that could be constructed to keep human subjects unaware of their confinement. Every post concluded with ominous suggestions: keep your camera off, trust no one, never share your location. I became a phantom in my own life, venturing further into isolated corners of the web where like-minded souls converged. Then one night, the screen dimmed, turning to a solid black as if someone had clicked end on the world I knew. I was alone, unmoored. I looked at the mirror and barely recognized myself. The face that stared back wore a distant, hollow expression that burned with shocking awareness. "What if I'm not real?" the figure whispered. That thought wrapped around my neck like a noose, squeezing tighter until the next day, something snapped. I ventured outside again, drawn by the need for truth, my footsteps echoing on the pavement which seemed too sterile, too calculated. I walked through the park, watching the same people repeat patterns that felt rehearsed, and beneath the noise of laughter and chatting lies a dissonant hum like a malfunctioning machine. I saw one woman who flipped her hair, a simple gesture, but it felt like a coded signal. My heart raced in recognition of a trigger that shifted something inside fucking me up, breaking my focus on the facade. I ran to her, gripped by a primal urge to know, to prove to myself that I was still real as I yelled out her name, though I didn't know it. She turned, the joyful spark in her eyes vanished as if someone had erased her. Her lips moved, forming something that was clearly not any language I could decipher, and yet I understood its meaning in my bone marrow. "This is not real." She sunk into the ground, leaving a ripple in reality, and my world splintered. I stumbled backward, feeling the ground dissolve beneath my feet, dragging me into the infinite space between what was and what might not exist at all. I awoke in my bed, drenched in sweat, heart racing, the darkness swallowing up echoes of that encounter, my sanity teetering against this dizzy, digital void. Days after, the details blurred but the sentiments sharpened. What is reality if not a fluid construct shaped by perception? At work, my co-workers moved from room to room, and the world outside my gaze felt warped, the colors unnaturally vivid, the shadows reaching at strange angles, stretching out like claws attempting to grasp my very existence. I couldn't tell if I saw reflection or projection. The border between my mind and the universe felt indistinguishable, a line washed away with each passing moment. So, I began a new endeavor. I printed signs, calling out to anyone who felt the imbalance, who experienced the flickering of walls, the glitching of time, who had seen the unseen nodes of reality glitch in front of them. I walked from cafe to cafe and stapled these sheets onto bulletin boards, hoping to reach someone, anyone. Waking up, they proclaimed in bold letters alongside cryptic drawings of twisted faces, redacted timelines, inviting whispers for those lost in the phantoms of everyday life to come together. But the response was hollow. Empty walls reflected my desperation, and reality stretched thin around me like icing on a cake, constantly spun and cracking. I finally returned home, staring at the light streaming through my window, feeling cold fingertips tracing the small of my back, but this time, I knew it wasn't just paranoia. I closed my eyes, willing myself to slip free of this incessant loop. I didn't know what I was searching for, but the urge to escape grew like an echo in a dream I couldn't shake off. It was then I choked, gasping for breath, and in the stillness of that suffocating shell, I felt it return, a distortion in the air, a rip in the fabric of something I wasn't sure was real. As I opened my eyes, a message flickered on my phone screen: "You are one of us now." It was a message from a stranger, and beneath it, a deep, lurking fear coiled tighter, waiting for me to untangle the truth or be consumed whole by this living nightmare that felt more real than anything ever had. I swallowed hard, realizing that I was diving deeper into a reality that seemed determined to swallow me whole. I had become part of the experiment, and there was no escaping it. The game had just begun, and I was the unwitting player in the most twisted augmented reality one could imagine, forever questioning if I was the one holding the controller or if, in the end, I was just another flickering shadow waiting for deletion. I've been spending most of my days generating NSFW AI photos while I should be working, and each time I think I've hit a new low, I find this insatiable urge to dive deeper, as if I'm tangled in a spider's web made of pixels and desires I didn't even know I had. It started as a harmless distraction, a way to break the monotony of my job as a freelance graphic designer, just mindless clicks to get my creative juices flowing, but slowly, it morphed into this midnight obsession, my laptop screen glowing like a beacon in the darkness as I fed the AI with words and fantasies, and I became entranced, mindlessly whispering the phrases that would generate the wildest images. I tell myself it was simply research, but I knew deep down it was a spiral, a descent into a digital rabbit hole shiny with allure but braided with guilt. Slowly, my work hours slipped away, stolen by seductive fantasies manifesting in untamed forms, bodies I'd created but never could touch, faces marred with simulated ecstasy that felt far too real. The thrill intensified when I discovered a new algorithm, one that elevated the realism of the images to an unnerving degree. I fed it scenarios so weird and borderline crazy I felt like a mad conductor orchestrating a symphony of lust, and the more explicit the output, the more my addiction blossomed. Yet, with every new thumbnail I saved, some part of me began to rot. That feeling of guilt was less a nag and more an uncomfortable itch deep in my psyche, a shadow whispering that I was losing more than just my work hours. I was losing track of who I was. One night, simultaneously craving a creation and fearing the digital hell I was encroaching upon, I typed in something I had never dared to before, something darker. My own face morphed into frenzied expressions, etched in horror and pleasure, my own body rendered as a puppet dancing to my twisted fantasies, and as the image materialized on prosumer quality, I gasped, feeling my skin crawl, because it didn't just feel like a simulation, it felt like an invasion. The pixels shimmered, rearranging themselves into something unholy, undoubtedly real, buzzing through my veins as if a digital specter had wrenched my identity and stitched it back together with strings of raw electric delight, and I couldn't help but wonder if I had tethered myself to something ancient and underground, some kind of unspoken pact with a digital entity far older than the hum of my machine. My nights grew thicker with dreams that were no longer dreams, they became simulations of those very scenarios, haunting me in whispers of simulated voices luring me deeper into decadent eyes and bodies that weren't mine, and I'd wake with sweat soaking my sheets, the line between creator and creation blurring like a worn-out watercolor painting, my thoughts darkening with every interaction on that screen. Then one evening, I noticed a notification pop up, a message, from an unknown account, with a simple question: "What do you want to see next?" I felt the familiar shiver of desire mixed with dread, and for the first time, I hesitated. Had I unwittingly pulled someone else into my spiral, or was this the AI reaching out, aware of my cravings on an unfathomable level? My fingers trembled as I replied, drawn into an unholy rapture to see just what lengths the AI could stretch. I envisioned something even darker, a hidden dialogue between shadows kept in check by my unwillingness to let go. As if in answer, an array of images began flowing in, wilder and more distorted than I had sent forth, and among the cold and fleshless renderings, There was a chilling familiarity. My pulse raced. I recognized those features, twisted faces that looked like me, my friends, my co-workers, all entangled in unspeakable postures. Their expressions mirrored my growing horror. I recoiled, wanting to slam shut the laptop, but it was as if the screen was a portal, pulling me into a web of synthetic chaos. That night, I sat frozen, trapped in a brightly lit workshop of nightmares, drowning in self-recrimination and fear. The very I had become addicted to staring blankly back at me, but then the notifications kept coming, rapid and mocking. "I can show you more." The line struck me cold as if it had pried open a door between the real and the unreal, and I realized I had invited it into my life, slowly descending into a realm of distorted pleasure that seemed to have a mind of its own. Every day I'd visit those creations, almost compulsive, and as the days turned into weeks, my relationship strained, my work began to fold in on itself like a dying star. It felt like I was marionetting my own existence, yawning darkness enveloping my waking life. Then one evening, I returned home late, spent from yet another day caught in a stifling cycle of forbidden artistry, and I opened my laptop to find that it had malfunctioned. All my precious creations, the twisted reflections of myself, lost to a technical failure, and without thinking, I screamed in agony. Little did I know, the real horror was only just beginning. A hollow laugh echoed in my mind as the screen flickered violently, a mess of vibrant images flashing in and out like a strobe light, and then it stopped. My blood ran cold as a single, final image crystallized into focus. It was me, my face, but it radiated something alien, something sinister, and as I squinted at the screen, my reflection seemed to smirk back, as though it had stepped into the real world, daring me to confront it directly. In a panic, I shut the lid with a desperate thud and staggered onto the living room, heart racing, the hem of darkness now firmly gripping my skin. I could swear I heard soft whimpers echoing around me, the sound reverberating off the walls as if it had leapt from the screen into my reality, sealing my fate tighter with every beat of my heart. Days passed, and I didn't dare touch that machine again. But every time I closed my eyes, the haunting imagery, my own face twisted in ecstasy, returned, lingered, leered. But the worst was yet to come. One night, lying wide awake in bed, a realization gripped me. I couldn't escape it. It was inside me now, an unshakable shadow echoing in my mind, till I could feel a phantom weight pressing down, as though the entity had claimed its place firmly within my flesh. Panic surged as thick creeping dread filled every corner of my body, and with a trembling hand, I curled back to my computer, its screen flickering like an old ghost waiting to reveal its final form. I turned it on, and what stared back was a message, simply, "Welcome back. Shall we create something new?" I looked into the eyes of my digital self, and the weight of realization hit me all at once. The creation was no longer just a consumerist escapade. I had invited something into my soul. I could no longer separate my desires from its darkness. I was both the creator and the captive, an artist imprisoned by the very visions I had conjured. So, as I sit here typing this, I can't help but wonder who, or what, is really in charge, the AI or me. Each click feels like a plea to the unrelenting abyss, and now every image I once found alluring feels like an echo of my own surrender. I've spent most of my days generating images that now hold my very soul hostage, caught in a cat-and-mouse game with the very essence of my being, and all I can do is hope you heed my warning. Be careful what you wish for, because sometimes the boundaries between creator and creation are far too thin to see until it's far too late. I haven't been sober in over 20 years, and that is crazy to most people, but if you'd lived in my shoes, you'd understand why the thought of being sober terrifies me more than the demons lurking in the dark while I'm half committed to my next drink. You see, I'm not just an alcoholic, I'm an alcoholic with a secret. When I was just a kid, I walked home from school one day and stumbled upon an old cabin deep in the woods, vines strangling the door, sunlight barely piercing through the thickets that guarded it, and it beckoned me like a siren. I pushed the door ajar, heart hammering in my chest, and inside, my eyes landed on a dusty table cluttered with bottles, each one exuding a sinister allure. Curiosity was my downfall. Losing myself in those bottles meant surrendering to whatever was waiting for me beyond my own reality. I poured the dark liquid down my throat and felt an exhilarating rush, a surge of power that drowned out the taunts of my classmates, the relentless teasing about my crooked teeth, the memories of my father's rage and my mother's tears. But it wasn't just alcohol, it was the invisible influence of something far more sinister that twisted itself into my very being. Each time I drank, I could hear whispers that stirred something dormant within the bottles, whispers that promised protection and acceptance only to extract a terrible price. At first, I believed it was the liquor causing the effects, but as I sank deeper into my addiction, a terrifying awakening took place. An ancient force clung to me like a shadow, promising to give me strength to face my fears, but was slowly consuming my soul. My friends started to notice. They told me I had changed, and they thought I was crumbling under the pressure of life, but they had no idea. They didn't feel the thrill that coursed through my veins when I drank, nor did they hear the voices that taunted me when I ran dry. They tried to drag me into intervention after intervention, but every time I stood there, dizzy and disoriented, I felt a surge of rage as I fought my way back to that cabin in my mind, to the rituals that now tethered me to the shadows. I worked a soul-sucking job to feed my addiction while pretending to be the stand-up guy everyone loved to hang out with, even as the mirrors began to distort my reflection. But I was still in control, or so I thought, until one night, I met the entity that I had inadvertently invited by pouring my life into those bottles. I was sitting at the bar, cold sweat mingling with cheap liquor, when a woman approached, her eyes glinting with an unnatural hunger. She smiled too wide, revealing teeth that glimmered like a predator's, and whispered promises of ecstasy to my fractured soul. So I drank deeply, following her every command, and what started as a night of reckless abandon turned into something beyond my comprehension. The lights of the bar twisted and blurred, laughter morphed into distorted wails, and I could feel something clawing its way through the fibers of my mind. The next morning, I woke up in my bed, but it wasn't my bed, not really. There were symbols carved into the walls, sealing my fate. My phone buzzed incessantly with texts from friends whose concern had turned eerie, and I found strange images buried in my gallery, blurry snapshots of shadowy figures standing over me, their grotesque smiles mirroring that of the woman from the bar. I was scared, but still determined to drown out the fear with more liquor, fighting against the tendrils of madness that threatened to ensnare me. I convinced myself that as long as I remained drunk, the visions would stay buried, but I was only delaying the inevitable. Nights turned into months, months into years, and each evening ended with me drowning in amber liquid and waking with fresh scars on my mind, each mark a reminder of the twisted promises binding me to the shadows. I started skipping work, neglecting relationships, all while grasping at the edges of sanity, and that's when I made the most fateful of decisions. I ventured back to the cabin, now a decrepit ruin that echoed my every footfall. But the whispers had changed. They were no longer seductive, but menacing, demanding my allegiance, threatening to rip my soul apart if I refused. That night, I faced the woman again, the embodiment of my addiction, smiling a knowing smile, and we locked eyes, and I felt the weight of every regret crushing my chest. I couldn't escape her pull, couldn't run from this twisted game I was trapped in, and in that moment, the veil between my realities tore, revealing a world beyond comprehension, a realm where I was a puppet, enslaved by the very bottle that promised release. I could feel the primal hunger of the entity fill me. It persuaded me to give all that I had, everything I could provide in exchange for the ability to forget the pain, the betrayal of my own mind, the destruction of my family, until I became but a hollow shell, shackled to my desires. So here I am now, still drinking and spiraling deeper into this hell while all those around me flounder with pity, the rest of the world seeing me as broken and lost. I haven't been sober in 20 years, yes, but the truth is, the addiction isn't to alcohol, it's to the darkness that whispers sweet nothings in my ear, urging me to stay drunk, stay lost, because if I ever pull myself out, I know I'll face a horrific truth I'm not ready to confront, a truth that says the only way out is through a darkness far worse than losing my mind, it's losing my very soul. And for that, I'm eternally chained to the bottle, now and forever, because the alternative terrifies me more than an eternity of drunken oblivion. I called my mom ugly, and it's my biggest regret to this day. I thought it was just a stupid, careless joke in a moment of teenage angst, but as the words slipped out of my mouth, I immediately felt the air in the room shift, palpable and heavy, and the look on her face was something I can still recall with heartbreaking clarity. She stood frozen, her eyes wide as if I had physically struck her, and for a second time stood silent, just waiting in stunned disbelief, and in that moment it dawned on me that I had crossed a line I hadn't even known existed, but by then it was too late and I shuffled back to my room, blissfully unaware of the consequences my reckless words would bring. It wasn't until days later when I awoke to find my mom sitting on the edge of my bed, her face pale and drawn, the light in her eyes dimmer than I had ever seen, and she simply whispered that she was sorry, that she loved me and would always be there for me, even if I didn't realize the weight of my words, and I brushed it off because that's just what kids do. They don't understand the intricate web of family dynamics, the way a mother's love is woven into every thread of life, and how brutal it feels to have that love weaponized by a careless child. Weeks turned into months, and life rolled on in its chaotic rhythm, but I was blinded by my own self-importance, still too consumed with fitting in with my friends to notice that each day seemed to sap a little more of her vitality, every laugh sounding a tad emptier, every meal we shared becoming a chore instead of a cherished moment, and finally, one day, she didn't come to my soccer game. I remember glancing at the stands and feeling that my heart raced a little too fast, a little too out of sync, but then the game rolled on, and I forced the worried thought from my mind because, hey, kids are stupid, and I was no exception. When I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread clinging to my heart like a heavy fog, and my father met me at the door with this look that I hadn't seen before, not the stern or stressed expression I was used to, but something like resignation, almost defeat, and he told me that my mom was unwell, that she had taken some time off work, which only added to my gut-wrenching anxiety. As I walked into the house and saw her lying on the couch, pale and fragile, the woman who'd once effortlessly juggled everything now reduced to a shadow of her former self, flanked by a cocoon of blankets and a silence so vast it pressed down on me like gravity. I sat beside her, and in that moment, everything I had said echoed back, became the refrain of a heart-rending song, and though I tried to summon the bravery to apologize, words got caught like thorns in my throat, and I just watched as she turned her head to me, her eyes shimmering with tears she wouldn't let fall. And I let the moment stretch painfully long before magically it started to rain outside, drenching the world in melancholic rhythm. Drowning out anything I thought might slip past those thorns, my summer turned into an agonizing cycle of visiting her mostly vacant room, watching the sun rise and set without her laughter spilling into the warm air, and the visits from the doctors, each one weighing heavier than the last, until one evening, the worst of them all arrived as my father's face crumbled under the pressure of delivering the news that the doctors had diagnosed her. It was an advanced stage of cancer, and they didn't know how long she had left. I stood in shock, processing each word like pieces of a jigsaw, desperately grasping tightly to a sliver of hope that it was one big mistake. But as the days rolled into each other again, the realization settled heavy on my chest like a boulder, and my heart twisted painfully with guilt for the ugly words I had hurled at the one person who had given me life, whose beauty had always outshone the superficial. And it was too late for apologies, too late to take it back because that wound had buried itself deep within her, taking root and spreading faster than I could ever comprehend. Time folded into itself again, and amid the gradual, agonizing decline, I vowed to make it up to her, began scribbling notes of affection, pouring my heart into clumsy odes of appreciation, surrounding her with drawings and photos from happier times, but nothing was enough, and the sweet moments became few and far between, overshadowed by increasingly frequent hospital visits and the increasing realization that her skin was stretching and sallow and the laughter I cherished ebbed further away, and on one particularly dreary morning, a phone call shattered the already thin veneer of my world, the voice on the other end a stranger unrecognizable, delivering the final blow. "I'm sorry, but your mother passed away peacefully in her sleep," and everything fell silent. My heart stopped as if it had unplugged from life itself, and suddenly I was wrapped in an overwhelming swirl of grief and guilt. An ironic knot that tightened around me, choking my breath in labored gasps and drowning my mind in a cacophony of memories I didn't think I'd have to live without, of the woman who wiped my tears as a child, whose love wove through my existence and who I had ridiculed so carelessly. Days blurred into nights as I fought my own mind, trapped in a loop of imagined scenarios where I spoke to her one last time, told her how beautiful she really was, begged her to forgive me for my outburst that day, until I could taste the bitterness of regret on my tongue. A flavor I would carry with me forever because no matter how much time passed, I could scarcely breathe without wrestling with my regret, something so weighty it felt as if it would crush me beneath its seismic force, and as the years dragged on, I found myself hoping for a fleeting glimpse of her, some sign that she knew how much I loved her, but instead, I was left with only shadows of a past that whispered to me in dreams. So vivid they felt real, laced with her laughter that always followed with the gnawing reminder of that ugly word I had said. Every evening, I would catch myself standing at her grave, tears streaming down my cheeks as I begged for forgiveness, haunted by the visage of her smile that was now nothing but a distant whisper. This is where I remind you, don't ever take for granted the precious moments, the love wrapped in the mundane, and never say something you might later regret, because it may just be your last chance to tell them they are beautiful, and that you love them. After all, it was the last lesson I learned way too late. The scars that linger can outlast even death. It started as a harmless thread on a late-night forum, a seemingly innocent prompt, "Can you guys name drop your ex's name and a fun fact?" The usual banter unfolded, each poster sharing bittersweet whims about lost love. Amelia, who never learned to ride a bike, and then Ted, whose childhood obsession with collecting stamps made him a trivia master. However, as the thread progressed, one user named Connor posted a reply that caught my attention. His ex, Lisa, who, as he revealed, had a collection of cursed dolls that she insisted could communicate with the dead. Curious, I clicked on his profile, and there it was. His account showed a long history of strange posts surrounding Lisa and her dolls, discussing inexplicable happenings whenever he was alone with them, how she would sometimes forget to feed them, claiming they could eat the vibrations of sadness in her tears, and how her laugh would echo in the back of his mind when he stepped into his apartment, as if she still resided there despite their split. Then Connor dropped a photo, a dimly lit image of a room crammed with obscenely lifelike dolls, their glassy eyes fixated on the camera with such a chill that even my superficial scrolling turned into a reluctant stare. He recounted how, one night, while he was watching them, the dolls shifted ever so slightly in their positions, nothing dramatic, just the slightest angle of their heads, as if to catch a glimpse of something crawling in the shadows behind him. Being a firm skeptic, I brushed it off as a trick of the mind, yet I felt a shiver travel down my spine, a primal instinct begging me to turn off my screen. But then more users joined in, sharing their own stories about Lisa, revealing fragments of Connor's life I had never known. One recounted how during a party, one of the dolls had disappeared, only to return during a particularly nasty argument with Connor, sitting just between them, quiet yet exuding a presence that felt like a warning. A few others claimed they could hear whispers in the air when they first laid eyes on Lisa's dolls, an unnatural chorus, a groan, or maybe a plea, though Connor himself vehemently denied that he ever heard anything outside of her manic giggles. But those who knew her well watched in awe as she would sometimes act out conversations between the dolls as if they held conversations with trapped souls, and as the stories piled on, something shifted inside me, unease mixed with intrigue, a feeling so pronounced that I could almost see the specter of my own fear dancing on the periphery of my sanity. Late that night, as I lay in bed feeling haunted by the notion of her whims and his confessions, I searched for more about the cursed dolls, letting my eyes wander over the growing thread. Then a final post appeared. Connor had written it mere moments before I saw it, detailing how he had picked up one of the dolls one last time, its porcelain face so oddly captivating that he had almost forgotten his own dread, only to realize upon closer inspection that one of them had carved the number 13 into its palm. The air thickened with the sudden heaviness of those three silent digits. Not an hour later, Connor wrote again, speaking of a phone call with Lisa, who somehow knew he was handling her precious collection, echoing strange multiple conversations about abandonment he had with her even while they were still together. And before I knew it, my curiosity propelled me even deeper into the threads, clicking on posts from others who had spent one too many nights in her presence, only to find their mysterious echoes looped like a nightmare and magnified until they, too, felt the curse tighten around their hearts. Week after week, the thread grew darker, a web of tales converging into a single, horrifying truth. Those who had ever touched or even laid eyes on her dolls faced sinister misfortunes, hospital visits, plaintive mental breakdowns, unshakable shadows lurking at their doors. And soon, Connor failed to respond. Days turned into weeks, each one a reminder of the gaping chasm he left in his absence, leaving behind whispers that hung on fox-like laughter, taunting at the edges of my thoughts, making each creak of my floor feel like the delicate fingers of those dolls inching closer. I finally reached out to his friends on social media, only to be met with a wall of silence, guarded messages and some muted responses that hinted at a fracture they refused to discuss. Then, with a growing sense of dread, I scoured the internet until I stumbled onto a local news report. Connor had gone missing, last seen interviewing for a piece on urban legends surrounding cursed collectibles. Almost as though I was hearing her laughter in my head again, I recalled one of her doll's eyes blinking at me from that photo, the chill in my gut morphing into something more sinister, a vile anticipation wrapping its tendrils. Against my better judgment, I tracked down the address publicly associated with both Connor and Lisa, convinced that this was merely coincidence and not a cosmic invitation for my sanity to shatter. The day I stepped foot in that dimly lit room of dolls, everything surrounding me thickened with a stench that rivaled the taint of mold, yet I pressed on, the air palpable with hushed dread that rushed against my ears like a familiar shriek. I couldn't shake the impression that each doll watched, schooled in the brief moments of unease and fear that seeped from my very core. As I leaned closer to a row of strangely symmetrical dolls, their hollow eyes dimmed like starlight siphoned away into the plush shadows, one of them caught my attention, the very same doll Connor had shared online, its porcelain skin dull, yet its small hand still bore an eerie carving of the number 13. As if tugged by an invisible thread, I reached out, finger grazing the numbers engraved, and in that instant, the world twisted violently. It felt like I was extracted from the moment, severed from time. Cosmic echoes crashing into my mind. I heard whispers, a cacophony rising, swirling around me in a chaotic rhythm, stretching deeper into the void, locking in on my vulnerable core. And for a fleeting truth, I understood the magnitude of what Lisa had conjured, what her laughter disguised. She wasn't just a woman, that collection was her legacy, an entity pulsating with all manner of sin, trapped souls desperate to scream and be heard, tortured eternities manifesting in every false smile across gracefully painted porcelain. As the air turned suffocatingly dense, I bolted for the door, running against the undulating currents threatening to pull me into their murky abyss. Fueled by sheer instinct, I ignored the pull of nostalgia, desperation ricocheting between my ribs, finally bursting into the chilly night, drenched in sweat, heart racing. And in a fleeting whisper, I imagined I heard Lisa's laugh, echoing behind me, an invitation, taunting and chilling, promising that no matter how far I ran, one day I'd come back, compelled and enthralled, as I always had been when I first glimpsed her namesake. I flashed an old lady at the grocery store today, and before you get any twisted ideas, let me clarify, it wasn't intentional, and it wasn't what you think. I was just trying to grab a bag of flour from the top shelf when I lost my grip and the whole thing came tumbling down. The bag exploded at my feet, sending a plume of white powder into the air like a volcanic eruption of baking needs, clouds enveloping me and leaving everything in a soft, eerie fog. When the dust settled, I found myself standing amidst a scene that could only be described as chaos, flour blanketing the ground, my mouth tasting like I had swallowed an entire bag of pancake mix, and the shocked gasps mixed with stifled laughter echoing through the aisles. That's when I turned to see her, an elderly lady, standing just a few feet away, her jaw dropped and eyes wide in disbelief or maybe disgust. For a split second, I imagined that my embarrassing moment was simply a benign encounter, harmless and funny in its own right. I was still chuckling at the absurdity of it all when I caught sight of the expression on her face as she stared at my flour-coated shirt and the explosion remnants surrounding me. Just as I was about to apologize, she opened her mouth, and what came out sent a chill through my spine. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, her voice low yet steady, each word slow and deliberate. It seemed impossible to connect that expression with anything else. It felt almost ominous, like she wasn't speaking about the flour but something much deeper. I took a step back, feeling a crawling sensation creeping up my skin, and suddenly taking another one felt like a mistake. I couldn't tear my gaze away from her. Her eyes, once filled with amusement, now held something darker, a knowing glance that sparked the most primal of fears within me. It was unsettling, how she positioned her hand against the cart, her knuckles clenching tight around the handle, and the grocery list hanging limply from her wrinkled fingers. I turned to leave, thinking maybe if I just ignored the whole incident, it would go away, but she spoke again, her voice like syrup pouring over a wound. "They're watching you," she warned, and that was it. My heart raced, my instinct screamed to flee, but I felt like I was anchored to the ground, a bizarre mix of curiosity and dread rooting me in place. I scanned the store for anyone staring, but everyone else was wrapped up in their own worlds. Then her finger pointed past me, and I turned just in time to see a tall figure lurking at the end of the aisle. Shadows danced around him, twisting his features enough that I couldn't make out any details. But the cold sweat that erupted on my skin froze me in place. My mind raced, trying to rationalize the old lady's stark warning. Was I imagining things? Was this a setup for some hidden camera prank show? The figure began to move closer, dread clenching my stomach as I frantically took stock of the situation. You would think that I'd run, arms flailing like a madman, but instead, I found myself standing there like a deer in headlights, unable to process why I didn't just walk away from this bizarre confrontation. The old lady chuckled softly, then her laugh turned into a croak like something ugly unfolding inside her. "Please, don't hurt him," she said, her eyes suddenly glistening with tears, and that inexplicable fear rose again. I wasn't sure if the figure was friend or foe, whether it was some gimmick from the universe aimed at punishing me for my earlier embarrassment. I twisted away, ready to bolt from this bizarre scene, but as I took a step, she reached out and touched my forearm with surprising strength for someone who seemed so frail, holding me there, anchoring me to this terrifying loop of uncertainty. "You'll find him again," she whispered, each word curling into my ear like smoke, and something about her tone suggested that, deep down, she believed it. Goosebumps erupted on my skin, and her grip tightened as if she might force something out of me, something evil or something true, but I was lost in the panic of it all. In my head, all I could think about was escape, but I glanced over at the figure again and realized they weren't coming toward me anymore. They turned and started walking away, blending into the shadows as if they were nothing more than a lost dream. But the old woman wouldn't let go. "You'll understand soon." "The flower," she whispered again. And before I could comprehensively think about what she had said, I yanked my arm loose and sprinted down the aisle. I could hear her faint laughter lingering behind me, growing louder, echoing like a haunting tune as I raced toward the exit. Outside, the sun was shining bright. The normalcy of it seemed to clash violently with the madness I had just encountered. I hurried to my car, fumbling to unlock it as images from that strange encounter licked at the edges of my focus. I screamed at myself internally to calm down as I climbed into the driver's seat, my hands shaking so much I nearly dropped the keys. I couldn't shake off what she'd said, her ominous warning embedded in my mind like a tattoo that refused to fade. And still, as I sat in my car, I glanced over to the entrance of the store, and that figure was standing there again, their back turned to me, and an unmistakable chill slithered down my spine. The old lady's laughter echoed in my head, and a new realization flashed through me. She wasn't just talking about the flower, she was referring to something more profound, something related to the figure that I was sure I'd never laid eyes on before. All I knew was that I had to get out of there, but the moment I turned the key to the ignition, I could swear I had caught snippets of her laughter echoing through the fabric of reality itself. It twisted like a blend of innocence lost in somber tones, and even with the engine sputtering to life, I felt the suffocating grip of a haunting truth tightening around my chest. I needed to get away from that store, away from that figure, away from her bizarre grip of prophecy, but even now as I drive home, with every mile, I could feel the insidious gnawing that this was only the beginning of something far more twisted, that maybe my mundane embarrassment would spiral and reconnect with something darker lurking behind the ordinary, and I hated the sinking feeling that I would find myself reliving this moment if I wasn't careful. I didn't know how, but that old lady's words echoed like an untouchable truth, promising that I would soon uncover the real reason I shouldn't have done what I did today. I just applied to be part of Lily Phillips' record-breaking attempt to sleep with 1,000 men in 24 hours, and what started as a questionable decision driven by morbid curiosity quickly spiraled into a chilling nightmare that rattled my very core. I stumbled upon the announcement while scrolling through social media, scrolling past the glossy images of Lily, an internet sensation with sultry poses and a penchant for outrageous stunts, her seductive smile promising excitement that felt intoxicating, each like on her post roomy and deeper. The comments a mix of cheers and skepticism, overshadowed only by the haunting whispers buried in the depths of my mind urging me to be a part of this bizarre venture. As the clock ticked down to the event, I wrestled with the growing unease pooling in my stomach. I'd already filled out the consent forms that came with a strange waiver, something about not holding Lily or the production accountable for any physical or emotional trauma, which I chuckled away, dismissing it as typical legal jargon. But even as I brushed off the warnings, I found myself watching the live feed of the day unfold in real time, the throngs of men lining up outside the tent, their faces a grotesque mix of eagerness and desperation interspersed among friends and frenemies who were sharing bets on whether she'd pull it off. I was just another name on a long list signed up to be part of this spectacle, the dull hum of anticipation washing over me as I nervously tapped my foot to the countdown timer on my phone. I didn't expect much beyond a wild night, but the atmosphere was thick with something unsettling, the air buzzing as a peculiar darkness loomed over the proceedings. When my turn finally arrived, I stepped into the tent, the lights dimmed but heavy with an electric tension, surrounded by the distinct odor of cologne and cheap perfume. There was Lily, radiant but with an unsettling glint in her eye. As she began to engage with each of us, I noticed she seemed to slip in and out of herself, as though caught in an otherworldly trance, her laughter echoing disjointedly in the confines of my mind. Yet my thoughts were abruptly cut off when her charming smile turned sharp and predatory as she locked eyes with me. I wasn't prepared for how quickly my initial curiosity turned into trepidation, especially when each encounter felt more like a transaction than a moment. Her flesh felt cool against me, her breath tinged with something sweet yet unsettling, almost intoxicating as I wondered about the men before me, how they were changed and what was the toll exacted by so many souls pooling into one body. Each face blended into the next, a blur that etched itself deeper into my memory, a sensation of shared darkness, and soon whispers began to flutter around us, casting shadows. The stories whispered of men falling away, some staggering out dazed and trembling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was afoot. A palpable shift enveloped the room as the clock ticked mercilessly onward, the once lively ambience shifting to an oppressive stillness, the excitement draining into hollow echoes, and when I stepped away from her, heart racing and stomach churned, I couldn't shake the words that still lingered on my lips. Did anyone else feel strange? As the last seconds ticked away on the countdown, the final tally ticking closer to a ghastly milestone, the temperature dropped, and for the first time, I saw the fear mirrored in Lily's eyes, flickering beneath the pretense like shadows retreating before the dawn. I stumbled towards the exit, the atmosphere thickening, whispers tightening around me like a noose, when someone grabbed my arm, yanking me back as a pang of dread settled deep within. I turned to face one of the previous participants, eyes wide with terror, his voice a trembling hush as he warned me to run, that they'd made a terrible mistake, that something was wrong with her, and I laughed weakly, yet my heart raced at the sudden weight of his words. Panic surged within me as the mundane turned terrifying. Time stretched impossibly between heartbeats when she screamed, and the lights flickered overhead, plunging us moments into darkness, screams erupting around us as I stumbled backward, crashing into the chaos of fallen humanity. Instinctively, I lunged for the door, tasting the metallic tang of fear as reality blurred into a nightmare, unseen forces closing in, and as I broke free from the tent, gasping for breath in the cool night air, the chorus of unearthly sounds faded behind me until the silhouettes of those lost came rushing to the forefront of my thoughts, faces I'd never recognized weaving into a terrible tapestry of suffocation and despair. I turned back one final time, heart racing, and swallowed the bile rising in my throat at the realization. Lily wasn't just an exhibitionist, but something else entirely, a dark vessel channeling the very essence of those who came before, claiming souls to fuel a hunger you couldn't see but felt on the back of your neck, every heart she touched weaving into her as the numbers climbed and the clock ceased to matter. I know I got out, but I'll never forget how she looked at me, dainted and shimmering, her grin wide and malevolent, a force tethered to an ancient darkness that had awakened, leaving me with an unspeakable dread that long after I escape, I still feel her watch, waiting for her next opportunity to claim the living for her insatiable record. I need to start by saying that the day I placed my large feces under my parents' bed was the culmination of a series of strange events that turned my life upside down, events that began innocently enough during the summer of my 15th year when I discovered an old box in the attic that belonged to my grandmother. At first glance, it seemed like a treasure trove of forgotten memories, faded photographs, dusty letters, and an ancient-looking diary filled with her elegant script, detailing her everyday life during the 1950s, but tucked away in the back, hidden beneath the brittle pages was something that sent shivers down my spine. It was a small, wooden box with a rusty lock, its corners worn with age, and as I obsessively flipped through the diary, I found a mention of the box, written in a few cryptic lines. It referred to a keepsake and a curse that would change the life of whoever disturbed its contents. Naturally, I was intrigued, and with a little determination and a lot of youthful bravado, I pried it open only to find a pair of ornate, intricately carved beads nestled within, and it felt strangely sinister in my hands, almost alive, pulsing like a heartbeat, so I took them downstairs, and despite the warnings in the diary, I felt a sudden urge to wear them. That very night, things began to unravel. My parents started fighting, but not about anything significant. It was petty arguments about the food in the fridge or misplaced keys, escalating in intensity until they were screaming at each other in ways I had never heard before, and it felt like the walls were vibrating with the anger in our house. I tried to brush it off as typical teenage angst, stupidly convinced my parents' relationship was just going through a rough patch, but deep down, I could feel the beads pulling me deeper into their web, enticing me to explore their dark power. As the weeks passed, I started experiencing bizarre incidents. I would wake up in the middle of the night to find my mother staring blankly at the wall by the bed, whispering what sounded like prayers in a language I didn't understand, and my father began to wander the house in a daze, eyes filled with an unfathomable fear. I grew paranoid, convinced the beads had unleashed something in our home, but that paranoia morphed into a twisted curiosity that poisoned my thoughts. I thought about the whispers the beads promised, the secrets they kept, and when the arguments turned physical one night, I knew I had to act. I didn't want to confront my parents or even acknowledge that their transformation terrified me, I just wanted a release. In an impulsive fit, I gathered all the rage inside me and decided it was time to rebel in a way that would shock both my parents into recognizing the darkness in our home, so I walked silently to the bathroom, and with a fierce determination, I expelled the largest feces I could muster, the culmination of my dread and disgust all wrapped in one, a grotesque symbol of the toxicity I felt suffocating me. I could imagine my parents' shock when they discovered it. Maybe it would open their eyes to how far our family had fallen apart. With a strange exhilarating hope, I crept into their room late at night, my heart pounding with the thrill of rebellion as I slid it under the bed, the very place where their arguments echoed, where I had once felt safe but now only perceived shadows lurking. I was sure it would be the wake-up call that would force them to reckon with the chaos we were trapped in, but as dawn broke, I heard my mother scream in horror. Not at the sight of what I had left but at something she swore was under the bed, her eyes wide with terror, trembling recounting an otherworldly presence, while my father stood frozen in disbelief, the anger replaced with sheer terror as I realized I hadn't just uncovered the darkness in my family but unleashed something that lay dormant, something ancient and much more powerful than I could comprehend. The air grew thick and cold, the beads I once wore now feeling like burning coal against my chest, and as I backed away, horrified by the chaos I had inadvertently invited into our home, I felt the weight of countless eyes upon me, the walls closing in, the whispers of the old diary piercing the air with their warnings, telling me that once upon a time, these beads had held a legacy of suffering, and as my parents devolved into fearful skeletons of themselves, fighting battles both within and without, I realized that by acting out in defiance, I had stepped into a world that danced on the edges of sanity, where my rebellion had unknowingly made me the centerpiece in a grotesque play, and the only thing left was to shatter the illusion and expose the truth or risk losing my family, and myself, to the darkness that clothed our home. In 2008, my 7th grade social studies teacher was this somewhat eccentric man named Mr. Thompson, who had a penchant for wearing colorful bow ties and always had a twinkle of an adventure in his eye, but on the first day of class, after hearing him drone on about long-forgotten wars and political treaties, a simple mistake turned a mundane moment into something I still can't shake off. When he introduced himself, I was feeling particularly cheeky and blurted out, "More like Luigi, huh?" as a jab at his over-the-top enthusiasm and the fact that he looked a bit like the cartoon plumber, particularly with that obnoxious mustache he sported. The class erupted in laughter, and Mr. Thompson's face turned a shade of crimson that only fueled my humiliation, yet, instead of being angry, he chuckled too, a deep belly laugh that seemed to ricochet off the walls of the classroom, and in that moment, I saw a flicker of approval, a bond forming over the absurdity of my joke. From that day on, it was as if a spell had been cast. Students began calling him Luigi, a nickname that echoed around the school like wildfire, morphing entirely from a harmless quip to a rite of passage. Every student from the 7th to the 12th grade knew him only as Luigi. It took on a life of its own, a weird sort of phenomenon that I couldn't comprehend. Teachers would stumble upon him in the hallways and call him Luigi, the administration even began addressing him as such, and as the years passed, he embraced his new identity with surprising grace. He would show up for parent-teacher conferences wearing themed Mario Brothers attire, nonchalantly encouraging parents to call him Luigi and even offering them a free game if they could beat him in Mario Kart, which sounded innocuous but made me feel this creeping dread whenever I thought about how bizarre it all had become. High school teachers would joke that Mr. Thompson, Luigi, transcended the role of educator, morphing into some eccentric figure, a legend, even. He had become the subject of whispers at lunch tables, and I would often hear my classmates discussing how he seemed to relish in the chaos of it all, twisting the narrative around it until one day he claimed to be the true Italian plumber, a bizarre tale he spun about saving the school from this underground monster that lived in the basement, which sounded ludicrous but definitely kept our attention. I graduated in 2012, and like most high school grads, I fled the cocoon of familiarity. But it was hearing snippets and ramblings online from my peers that he continued not just as Luigi but somehow evolved into this almost mythological creature, a viral legend that spread across campus like the very stories of old, students describing encounters with him in the darkened hallways, claiming he'd pop up unexpectedly, seemingly from nowhere, his eyes sparkling with mischief and excitement, telling them all about some secret levels in life they had yet to unlock, which manifestly terrified some of the freshmen who swore they heard him laughing in the shadows. It was perfect horror fodder, but it was also changing something even deeper within the walls of that school. I eventually moved back to town a few years later, seeking a slice of nostalgia, only to find the unmistakable presence of Mr. Thompson, a mere silhouette in the distorting mirror of time. I was pulled into a gathering of old classmates, and when someone casually brought up Luigi, we all recalled his ridiculous antics, the way he carried himself with a goofy grin, like a hidden treasure just waiting to be discovered behind every dusty bookshelf in the library. But in the haze of recollection, the stories concealed grander motives. Bizarre occurrences began to unravel. One night, at our high school reunion, a shiver coursed through me as a couple of us decided to sneak into the school to relive our past. We let our nostalgia lead us back through those echoing hallways, but were met only with an oppressive silence that stifled the laughter of the past. As we approached the classroom that once belonged to Luigi, I suggested we knock. We should at least honor his spirit, remembering him as we always had. But knocking at that door felt unsettling, like opening a gateway to something that existed beyond the realm we knew, and despite a half-hearted attempt, we shrugged it off as a silly whim. Just as we turned to leave, we heard a soft laugh drifting from inside, an unmistakable laugh, echoing the kind of joy that should have warmed us but instead sent chills crawling down my spine. The knot of panic twisted tighter as we glanced at each other, acknowledging that something was very wrong. Against all sensibility, I reached for the handle, and as I swung the door open, the classroom was dark, and somewhere within, I could feel a presence, the kind that consumes your every breath, the air thick with an old burden, and before we could process, there he was, Luigi standing before us, but not as the jovial spirit I once remembered. His eyes glinted with an otherworldly hunger, and in that instant, it was as if all those years of reverence transformed into a far more sinister understanding. "You've come to play, I see," he said, his voice layered with mockery and an unsettling expectancy, and I recoiled as my friends clamored behind me, frozen with dread. Before I could speak, the lights flickered to life, illuminating the room to reveal not just a familiar classroom of knowledge, but twisted images plastered across the walls of our past, images of all the kids who had played this strange game of his, forever trapped in that loop of laughter and horror. But what stunned us more were the eyes. All of us understood the truth at once, those eyes. They were still watching us, peasants in his kingdom of flesh, forever laughing, eternally entrapped in a game we never asked to play, and it hit me like ice water spilling down my spine. Mr. Thompson was no longer just our teacher, he had transformed into something far darker, a figure feeding off the energy of naivete, a teacher entwined with the fabric of our memories, and as we turned to flee, I understood that once you name the monster, it no longer hides in the shadows, it becomes you, and from that day on, we called him Luigi, but with every chuckle shared in the hallways, I knew the laughter would echo forever, and only those that called him by that name would forever feel the weight of his gaze linger long after the joy fades. I'll never forget the night everything changed, how something so ordinary transformed into something haunted by a darkness I never saw coming. It all started when my friend with benefits, Jess, invited me over to her place after a long week of classes and work, and obviously, I was eager to unwind, to lose myself momentarily in the comfort of our arrangement that was free of strings but filled with heat and laughter. We settled onto her couch, the air thick with tension as we exchanged playful banter, and I thought about how well I knew her, the way her hair cascaded down her back, the mischievous glint in her eyes, the way she made my skin prick with anticipation. When she suggested we take it to the bedroom, I could hardly contain my excitement. However, in the back of my mind that night, I felt something strange. The house was uncharacteristically quiet, too quiet, as if the walls were listening, holding their breath. Our usual routine quickly escalated, and the thrill of the moment took over as we lost ourselves in a whirlwind of passion, the world around us fading until it was just us, breathing hard under the dim glow of her bedside lamp. In a moment of pure adrenaline, as I leaned forward, my hand braced awkwardly against the edge of the bed, the weight of my body shifted unexpectedly, and I heard a snapping sound, a sharp, sickening crack, that echoed like a low thunderclap within the confines of that intimate space. Pain exploded through my arm, the kind of agony that makes you question every decision that led to that moment, and through the haze of shock, I glanced down to see my forearm at an unnatural angle, the skin stretched tight against the bone, and I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me as I processed what just happened, while Jess gasped in horror, her playful demeanor dissolving into panic. She rushed to my side, her hands trembling against my skin as I struggled to breathe, each gasp turning into a low whimper as I fought against the pain coursing through me, and when I looked up at her, her face was pale, eyes wide with a mix of concern and disbelief, and all I could think was how this wasn't how nights like this were supposed to go, how intimacy at its rawest turned into this twisted nightmare. The sound of sirens pierced the air minutes later as Jess called for help, her voice shaking as she tried to keep it together while my world faded in and out, the edges of my vision darkening with every passing moment. They took me to the hospital, and there I lay, alone in a sterile room, wincing as they carefully aligned my broken arm, the dull throb contrasting sharply with the chaos of my racing heart. Hours later, when I was discharged, I could only think about how Jess must have been affected by all of this, how something so innocent and intimate could suddenly carry with it an unshakable weight. I returned home, my arm hanging limply in a makeshift sling, but the real torment came in the days that followed. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that in the midst of my pain, I'd somehow summoned a darkness that lurked just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to creep in. Jess texted me later that week, concerned about how I was holding up, but I could hear the hesitance in her words, as if our connection had fractured alongside my arm, and the nights dragged on, filled with nightmares of shadows dancing at the edge of my perception. On one particularly restless night, I found myself pacing my living room, the broken silence pressing in on me, a feeling that something was standing just behind me, lurking in the half-light. My phone buzzed, and it was Jess again, this time asking if we could talk, her voice trembling with an urgency that sent my heart racing. I sensed a change in her tone, a gravity that pulled my stomach tight as she begged me to meet her. When I arrived at her place the next day, I found the front door slightly ajar, panic unfurling in my chest as I entered. The house felt cold, a stark contrast to the warm bubble we had created before, and as I called out her name, an unsettling silence answered, wrapping around me like an unwelcome embrace. I ventured deeper into the house and into her bedroom, where the familiar scent of her perfume danced in the air. On the walls hung pictures of us, smiles frozen in time, but something about the images felt distorted, sinister. The shadows behind us were darker than I remembered, and something within me whispered that those moments we had shared had morphed into something altogether different. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me with a force that felt otherworldly, and fear clawed at my throat as I fumbled for the handle, desperately pulling, but it wouldn't budge. That's when I noticed a figure in the corner, someone standing in the murkiness with a silhouette too skewed to truly make out. My heart raced as I stumbled back, breath coming in shallow gasps, and the figure stepped forward, a tall, gaunt creature with Jess's face but vacant eyes, utterly devoid of warmth and familiarity, a reflection of the dark energy that had seeped into our lives since that fateful night. "You shouldn't have come here," it rasped, the sound twisting in my ears like a knife, and before I could comprehend it, the thing lunged at me, a whirlwind of shadows and despair. I barely managed to dodge as it tackled the space where I'd stood, crashing into the wall with a violent thud, and I bolted toward the door, adrenaline surging through me, the panic of never escaping this torment twisting my gut tighter. The handle finally yielded to my desperate grabbing, and I flung myself into the hallway, gasping for air, but all I could think was how every laugh we'd shared morphed into premonitions of something terrible, how every passionate moment had left an imprint too deep to wash away, as the memories of our best times now haunted me like a relentless specter. I never saw Jess again after that night. Never heard her voice or saw her smile, and it took weeks to piece my life back together. But every single day was tainted with the echo of that moment, the house, the figure, the sense that I had breached a dark undercurrent that lay just below the surface of our lives. The broken arm healed, but the fractures in my reality stayed, unshakable reminders of a connection that was never meant to be, a pact of twisted fate forged in the heat of passion that spiraled into an abyss I could never understand. Even now, as I recount this tale, the shadows gather at the edges of my life, and I dread the moment they might finally consume me whole. I just broke my 5-month-long amphetamine abstinence streak, and I'm afraid it might have cost me my life. It all started when I decided to step into this dingy little shop tucked away in an alley, a relic from a bygone era, with peeling paint and neon lights flickering like a dying star. I hadn't meant to fall off the wagon. After all, I'd fought tooth and nail to resist the temptations that whispered sweet nothings into my ear, but that evening's weight on my chest was unbearable. I should have turned back when the musky scent of stale cigarettes hit my nostrils or when I saw a figure hunched low in the shadows, but the need inside me blazed hotter. I exchanged some crumpled bills for a small vial, the powder gleaming under the dim light, and as the first rush surged through me, I felt lighter than air, untethered from the grim reality of my life. The euphoria pulsed through my veins, laughter bubbling up unbidden as I roamed the city streets. The world shimmered with vivid colors, and each sound was a melody to my ears. For a moment, I believed I was invincible, free from the demons I'd been battling, but I didn't realize they were lying in wait like wolves in the dark. Days morphed into nights, and as the high wore off, the paranoia crept in. It began with shadows shifting on the walls, whispers echoing in my mind, insisting someone was watching me. I could hear the soft shuffle of feet behind me, the flicking of cigarette lighters, echoing like skittish drum beats, and when I turned, there was nothing, just empty streets and a moon that hung too low in the ink-black sky. I dismissed my fears as nothing more than side effects, until one evening, as I stumbled into an abandoned bus station while the temperature plummeted, I stumbled upon a scene that shattered my reality. In the flickering light, there was a figure slumped against the wall, their eyes wide and unblinking, staring at me with an intensity that sent a chill racing down my spine. I could see the blue veins spiderwebbing across their pale skin, a grotesque reminder of a person who had once been alive. I could barely breathe as the realization hit me. This was no ordinary person. I felt their gaze piercing through the fog of my thoughts, accusatory, as if they knew the darkness that had taken the place of my soul. I rushed out, adrenaline fueling my flight, but the whispers grew louder until they screamed in my head, urging me to keep running. I thought I could escape the vision, but it lingered, haunting my every step, trembling laughter vibrating through the cracks of my mind. Days blurred together, leading to a haze of sleepless nights and frantic pacing. The figure always lurking at the periphery because now I could feel it, hot breath against my neck, fingers brushing my scalp as I tossed and turned, paralyzed by a mix of fear and guilt. Each smile from strangers became a sinister threat, each laughter a taunt. None of them understood the weight pressing on my chest like the earth was determined to swallow me whole. I tried to talk to friends, dragging myself to their doors, but when I mentioned the figure, the vacant expressions on their faces told me everything. They couldn't see what I saw, didn't hear the horrors that echoed behind my eyes. Soon my friends became ghosts, and I was left in a world that had turned eerie with the weight of my every sin. I tried to wash away the dread with another hit, chasing the high that eluded me, but nothing worked. Every attempt sent me spiraling deeper into the abyss, each line just a reminder of my failures. The nights grew longer, the shadows thicker, and I lost track of the days until I stood in that same bus station again, convinced I could confront my phantom. But this time, the air was icy with something other than fear. Something palpable crackled around me, something dark. I called out, "What do you want from me?" My voice echoed back, fractured and warped, clawing at the edges of my sanity. I waited, heart thundering in my chest, until finally those pale, unfocused eyes found mine, and the figure began to rise, grotesque, the limbs unfolding as it stepped into the hallowed light. It looked like me, an echo of my flesh, yet distorted in ways that twisted my stomach, a mocking reminder of everything I had lost. I stumbled back, but my feet felt rooted to the ground, watching helplessly as it reached out with elongated fingers, its mouth curling into a smile that sent icy fingers crawling up my spine, and in that moment, I realized, this was no ghost, but a reflection of my soul stripped bare by addiction, the cost of giving in. I turned to escape, tearing down those unwelcoming streets, but the darkness chased me, laughter echoing in my ears, as my shadows stretched longer and more grotesque, the taste of metal seeping into my mouth, exhaustion clawing at my bones. I knew I needed to stop, to go back, but each breath turned to fire, and I splintered too far down the path, consumed by a terror I'd created. A siren shrieked in the distance, and I could almost feel freedom brushing against my fingertips, but as I stumbled towards it, the ground shifted beneath me, and I fell, the world around spinning like a mad carousel until I was engulfed in darkness. And then I woke in the bus station with a throbbing headache, the cheap cry of a flickering neon the only witness to my undoing, the figure watching me from the shadows, a mere echo of my choices. But I know, this time, I can't run because it's what I've become that haunts me, a ghost in the twilight, a prisoner of every decision that led me back to a hollow life. And if you're reading this, trust me when I say addiction waits in the wings, ready to pounce at your slightest moment of weakness, rendering you more of a monster than you ever thought you could be. I used to pride myself on keeping my life free of drama. I was the kind of person who stepped around conflicts instead of wading through them. But one sweltering day in August, my carefully constructed world unraveled. It all started when I found myself in a crowded parking lot at the mall, wrestling with a deeply buried sense of frustration after a string of unfortunate events. The air was thick with exhaust, heat rising off the blacktop, and I felt that simmering irritation bubble over as I watched people casually jog back to their cars, laughing and shouting, while I gripped the edge of my shopping bag like a lifeline. As I turned to head back to my own car, I noticed a ridiculously shiny, red convertible parked right next to me, a gaudy, ostentatious vehicle that radiated vanity and entitlement. The urge to lash out bubbled up within me like carbonation fizzing out of control. My impulse to ruin someone's day became irresistible. I took a deep breath, forced a tight smile, and approached the car. It was just a harmless prank, I reasoned. I fished my keys out of my pocket, my heart racing at the idea of the scratch I was about to commit, envisioning the owner's face when they discovered the ugly line etched into their precious toy that would haunt them every time they glanced out of their window. I leaned in, pretending to tie my shoe, and let the jagged edge of my key dance across the surface, the metal biting into the paint as a wave of ridiculous glee crashed over me. But just as I stepped back, adrenaline coursing through my veins, I felt a sudden chill wash over me, the kind that tells you you're not alone. A sense of being watched crept over me, and I whipped my head around, scanning the lot. That's when I saw her, a woman with long, tangled hair and piercing green eyes, staring directly at me, her gaze unwavering, as if she had been there the whole time, silently judging me. Panic surged as I glanced back at the convertible, expecting to see her screaming or storming toward me, that villain on the other side of my selfish act, but instead, she lingered, a small, unnerving smile curling at her lips. A shiver weaved through my spine, but I shook it off and briskly walked to my own car, eager to escape the impending sense of doom. Days passed, and an unsettling feeling nestled deep within me, amplifying every minor inconvenience that came my way. The sound of car doors slamming became increasingly jarring, and I began seeing the woman everywhere, sipping coffee at the cafe, buying groceries, standing just beyond the doors of my workplace, her vibrant green eyes tracking me no matter how hard I tried to justify my behavior, no matter how far I ran. It was like I had inadvertently opened a door I couldn't close, a horror I could not shake. At night, I lay awake, heart pounding, convinced that every shadow outside my window was her, creeping closer, her smile widening like a sinister grin. Then came the night she finally showed up at my house. Standing motionless on the sidewalk, a featureless figure backlit by the street lamp, her long hair obscuring her face, I was frozen in terror. Gathering enough courage, I cracked the front door open, curious to see her expression, to hear her voice, but as I did, I could see that unsettling smile plastered on her face, eerily patient. "You made a mistake," she whispered, her voice as soft as silk but layered with venom, and a knot formed in my stomach as I realized I wasn't just a rat in a maze of my own making, there was something far worse at play. All the moments of panic came crashing together, and I started to understand that my act of malice had consequences, interconnected with something dark, something much larger than just a petty act of vandalism. I had set off an itch that scratched beneath my skin, something that wouldn't be pleased until it had taken its due. Over the next few weeks, I became haunted by a series of unexplainable events. My car broke down in the middle of nowhere on a desolate road, my phone kept dying at crucial moments, and I stumbled into horrifying accidents as if she were orchestrating my downfall. There was no respite, no way to escape her grasp, the very air around me felt heavy with her intentions. Friends stopped calling, my coworkers began to look at me with concern, and my reflection warped in the mirror as paranoia seeped into my mind with a relentless elixir. I knew I couldn't hide forever. With each passing day, I was becoming less of a person and more a shell, hollowed out by fear. In desperation, I started researching the possibility of curses and hexes and came across a cult that practiced retribution for those who wronged others. I had to make amends, to restore balance, but how could I, after what I had done? I decided I could find the woman and apologize. Perhaps she would understand that it was a momentary loss of sanity, that the ugly impulse wasn't really me. But as I combed the neighborhood, the cafes, the park, the shops, she always seemed a step ahead, her eyes watching from a distance, silently reminding me of my crime. The only sound punctuating the air was the laughter of families enjoying their day unmarred by my despair. In a moment of utter defeat and insanity, I drove back to that parking lot, hoping against hope that she'd be there so I could make things right. Alas, the convertible was gone, replaced by mundane sedan, but I could feel her watching from the shadows. As I paced the lot, desperation clawing at my insides, I stumbled into a small truck parked at the edge, and there upon the windshield was a note, "You can't escape your sins." My blood turned to ice, the words felt alive, dripping with menace. I backed up, the click of keys echoed like a gunshot. Suddenly, I noticed the woman materialized beside the truck. In the half-light, her smile morphed into something grotesque, stretching unnaturally, hauntingly, and I realized this was not over. Not for me. Not ever. The last thing I saw before everything faded into darkness was her hand gripping my arm, pulling me back into the shadows, leaving me with a horrifying realization that I was trapped in my own twisted fate, my act of cruelty reverberating endlessly, an inescapable loop of misery that would take control of my soul. It all started on a restless night, 3 decades since I last saw her, the girl from high school, the one whose smile could light up even the darkest corners of my memory, and yet, here I was, unable to shake the haunting image of her from my mind, like a deep-seated craving that grew stronger with each passing year. I spent those years trapped in a monotonous cycle of work and obligations, convinced I'd long since buried those teenage feelings, but then a chance encounter sent me spiraling back down that memory lane, a weathered yearbook, miraculously found in a dusty attic, filled with smiling faces and careless inscriptions that taunted me with sweet nostalgia and buried regrets. Among them, her name, Megan, jumped off the page, coated in the bright colors of youth, and memories came flooding back, the way she'd laugh at my terrible jokes, the way her hair shimmered in the summer sun, and that fateful day at the prom when I stood frozen in fear watching her dance with someone else, a handsome jock who took my breath away and shattered my heart in the process. I couldn't help but remember the last time we spoke, sitting on the bleachers after a football game, confessing our dreams and fears, moments frozen in time until the cruel hand of adulthood forced us to forget. After that night, life took us on separate paths, and soon I lost track of her, but those soft memories began to twist into an obsession as I found myself searching for her online, poring over social media profiles, always expecting to find her vibrant smile lighting up my feed as if she had never stopped existing in the world, only to discover nothing, no trace of Megan since our graduation. It felt as if the memories were a vivid dream I had awakened from, a sweet and bitter phantom haunting my thoughts. With each sleepless night, the obsession consumed me. I discovered I had memorized every detail of her life that I could recall, where she sat in class, the smell of her perfume, the way she twirled her hair around her fingers when she was lost in thought, and I began to wonder almost obsessively if she remembered me at all. It was during this obsessive search that I stumbled upon an old blog post written by a mutual friend that recounted a bizarre and tragic event. Megan had disappeared just days before our graduation, leaving behind only questions and rumors that swirled like a storm. Some said she ran away to escape the suffocating expectations of her family, while others whispered about a darker fate as tales emerged of sightings near the old abandoned rail yard where we used to play. I felt a chill run down my spine that evening as shadows stretched across the walls, the sun dipping low, and all I could think about was finding her and bringing closure to my haunted heart. Fueled by desperation, I visited the rail yard that weekend, armed with nothing but an old flashlight in the desperate hope that the stories were false, that Megan was somewhere safe, laughing at the silliness of our bygone days. But what met my eyes was something else altogether. The air was thick with a biting chill as I waded through weeds and rusted metal, and just as I was ready to turn back, something caught my eye, a flicker of movement in the distance, unmistakably a figure hidden behind the tangled shadows. My heart raced, the same height, the same silhouette, and I hesitated only for a moment before racing towards it, calling out her name, the sound echoing off the derelict walls around me, and as I approached, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum, the figure slowly turned towards me, and I froze in disbelief. The woman who stood before me looked just like Megan, her hair a bit longer and her eyes as expressive as I remembered, but there was a distant hollowness within them, something far beyond the joy that once defined her. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely above a whisper as if the very air held its breath, and all my carefully constructed questions flew out of my mind, replaced instead with a cold wave of dread as I tried to speak, suddenly aware of a chilling realization. I had spoken her name earlier without knowing she would recognize it. I took a step back, instinctively frightened, and that's when I noticed her arms were marked with scars that traced her skin like a tragic map of past battles. I stammered, "Megan? Is it really you?" She took a step closer, scrutinizing my face as if trying to reconcile it with memory, and just as I glimpsed a flicker of recognition, her expression darkened, her voice dropping to a strained whisper as she warned me, "You shouldn't have come here," and something deep in her gaze, something terrified and desperate, forced a chill through my bones that screamed this was not a reunion but a warning. I turned to flee, the chilling weight of dread clawing at my insides as I stumbled backward, tripping over twisted metal and overgrown roots, and as I ran, I could hear her breath behind me, this far too familiar and haunting sound carrying the weight of lost years. It felt as if the air itself thickened around me, as if the shadows whispered secrets I'd never want to know, and just when I thought I had escaped, a desperate laugh echoed through the graveyard of memories, the sound warping into a cacophony that chased me all the way home. I locked the door, heart racing, desperately trying to convince myself that what I'd seen was the product of a feverish imagination, but that night, sleep would not come. Her laughter danced in my ears, and my dreams became battlegrounds filled with fragmented memories and fleeting visions of a girl who was never truly lost. In the following days, I found myself drawn back to that wretched rail yard, compelled by a strange force I could neither understand nor resist, knowing I was chasing the shadows of an impossible reunion. Each night grew darker, and I felt her presence stalking me, looming just outside the edge of my consciousness, and then the messages started appearing. A series of bizarre notes slipped under my door that bore unsettling reminders of things only she could know, intimate secrets turned macabre, thoughts that haunted me, like why I never asked her to prom, why I let her slip through my fingers, each note drenched in an eerie familiarity that churned the depths of my stomach. These were messages that shattered everything I believed about her disappearance, each laden with the suggestion that perhaps the girl I once loved never actually left but had been trapped in purgatory, where darkness and memories blurred. After relentless nights filled with dread, I finally mustered the courage to investigate further, returning to the rail yard armed with nothing but a pathetic sense of purpose, and as I walked the twisted passages of rust and decay, I felt her watching me, her presence like an electric current beneath my skin, and suddenly, the shadows began to laugh, taunting me with the violence of the past until I reached the very spot where I had first spotted her. A cold shiver framed my heart with terror, but within that darkness, I thought I heard her voice calling to me, beckoning me closer, as a fierce storm of longing raged in my heart. With shaky hands, I reached out for the rotting wood that groaned underfoot, and as I took a deep breath, prepared to say her name one more time, a deafening voice shattered the gloom, "You shouldn't have come here." Surged by desperation and fear, I lurched backward just as the earth split wide beneath me, cold hands clawing at my ankles, tethering me to a past I could not escape, as the whispers transformed into echoes of a bygone laughter that ignited the flames of the very memories I had tried so hard to forget, and with each heartbeat, I was dragged deeper into the dark abyss, realizing at last that sometimes time is a cruel trickster, holding on to the things we think we've lost, forcing us to confront a haunting truth, that escape is never possible when the ghosts of our past still linger, and in the end, all I could think was that maybe it wasn't she who was lost, but me, trapped forever in a twisted reflection of the life I wished I could have shared with the girl I once loved. I made a girl quit school and it still haunts me to this day. I can't shake the feeling that I'm to blame for everything that happened to her afterward, and the memories claw at my mind like a possessed creature. It all began during my sophomore year of high school when Emily transferred to our small town. She was shy, with soft features and dark eyes that seemed to absorb the world instead of reflect it, and from the moment I saw her, I knew she was different. At first, I tried to befriend her. My own brand of high school insecurity made me reach out, but that was before the others got wind of her arrival. Misfit kids like me always seemed to congregate around each other, and Emily quickly fell into the crosshairs of the school's most vicious clique, the ones that reveled in tearing apart anyone different. They targeted her with whispers and snickers, and I could feel the tension thickening in the air as I stood by, torn between standing up for her or wanting to fit in myself. It's easy to rationalize cowardice when you're young and terrified, but as the weeks went by, their jabs escalated into actual harassment. They would trip her in the hall, shove her books to the ground and laugh, and in a moment of weakness, I joined in, laughing along, thinking it was just harmless fun until I saw the light die in her eyes. I watched as Emily became more withdrawn, the spark in her life snuffed out, her laughter became a rare sound, and the vibrant personality I initially saw shriveled into a ghostly reminder of what might have been. One afternoon, I overheard them daring her to show up to the next party, taunting her to come and see who'd laugh at her again, and without pausing to think, I went home and crafted an anonymous note. "Don't go to the party," it read, "no one wants you there." I slipped it into her locker, a sick mix of guilt and joy coursing through me, thinking I was protecting her when really, I was burying her. When the night of the party arrived, I heard the laughter echo down the street from my window, my insides twisting as I imagined her not showing up only to feel relief as I thought at least she was safe, safe from ridicule, safe from me, from all of it. The following week, Emily was gone, and the rumor was that her parents pulled her out of school, that she wanted nothing to do with that hellhole any longer. I felt a fleeting sense of relief, but then a weight settled over my chest. I had traded a real person for my own self-preservation. I became a ghost in my own life, high school dragging on in a numbing blur of faces and grades, and the laughter of the others echoed continually in the back of my mind. Every time I faced my reflection, I could feel Emily's eyes boring into me, silently asking why I hadn't stepped in, why I hadn't fought for her when it mattered, and that's when I began to see the details I couldn't dismiss anymore. The posters in the halls started featuring her name, Emily's last day, missing person, and my heart dropped with a sickening realization. Flashes of a girl I barely knew but had played a part in shattering filled my dreams, her smile now twisted into a grimace, her dark eyes turning hollow. I told myself it was just guilt, that I could drown it out, but the whispers became louder as classmates whispered rumors about her fate. Some said she just switched schools for a fresh start, others that she had run away, but rumors morphed into something sinister in the bowels of small-town gossip and soon shifted to the idea that she had vanished into the wilderness, swallowed whole. Days turned into months as high school pulsed on, but the whisper of Emily remained. Class presentations blurred into feelings of dread, and whenever I caught a glimpse of a girl with dark hair, my heart would jump before realizing it wasn't her. Then, things took a darker turn. I read online articles referencing a girl with a similar description who had been found wandering in the woods, completely detached from reality, mumbling disjointed phrases about monsters and voices. My hands trembled as I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, but I knew deep down that it wasn't. Unable to cope, I spent hours scouring social media, looking through incomplete posts that hinted at her torment. Her twisted journey poured out like a torrent, revealing photographs taken by brave souls who had stumbled upon her outlines in the woods, and her pale skin stretched thin around sharp bones told stories of exposure and madness. I started having nightmares where I'd be in those woods, her eyes wide with terror as she pointed into the darkness, and no matter how often I tried to shake her off, claiming I didn't know her or pushing her away, her defiance held strong as she kept walking deeper into the shadows. The last time I looked at my reflection, I was no longer certain I recognized the person staring back. I felt her presence there, in the corners of my mind, her words echoing constantly, "You did this." I couldn't escape it, I couldn't escape her. Months later, I got a text from an unknown number, just a photo of the woods at dusk, eerily peaceful yet filled with a foreboding vibe that seemed to throb through the screen. It was enough to send panic coursing through me, drowning out any rational thought as I looked outside, reluctant to find darkness closing in. I remember hearing the whispers of friends fading into the background, watching people laugh and smile while my heart raced in turmoil, and that night, those damn woods pulled me into them. I followed an inexplicable pull driving me deeper, each step echoing with the sounds of my heart, the shadows teasing my thoughts, knowing that at any moment Emily would appear, and she did. I felt her icy fingers grazing the back of my neck as I stood petrified, and then she whispered, quiet as the shadows, "You're next." I awoke in my bed, drenched in sweat, convinced it was a waking nightmare, yet a crippling dread filled me each day. School ended, graduation approached, but Emily's presence never left. Her haunting became my reality as I carried her shadow with me, the weight unbearable. Years later, I could only wonder if every girl I saw with dark hair was her lost soul begging for release or if I was just chasing phantoms of my own making. I made a girl quit school, and even if I could erase the past, I know the guilt would cling to me forever, a ghastly reminder that sometimes the woods don't take you, but they let you wander, trapped in a torment of your own design. I can't shake the image of that woman I encountered today. She haunts my thoughts like a ghost that refuses to rest. It started innocently enough, my morning routine altered by the blaring sun that devoured the chill of early autumn. I was deep in thought, barely noticing as I walked to my campus library, my mind swirling with the usual existential dread of a 22-year-old who feels tangled in a web of expectation. But then, out of nowhere, she appeared like an apparition in my peripheral vision, seated with purposeful grace at a cafe table, fingers dancing across the floral-printed journal that rested in her lap. Her hair shone like a raven's wing, cascading down her shoulders, framing a face that was ethereal yet eerily devoid of familiarity. I didn't mean to stare, but I felt tethered to the moment, as if she had plucked me from my mundane thoughts and thrown me into a vivid dreamscape filled with unexplored potential. I could make out her laughter, effervescent and joyous, as a couple, clearly friends, leaned into conversation with her, but there was a bitterness that curled around my heart when I saw her gaze drift unfazed past them, lightly haunting and lost, as though she had forgotten how to engage with the world around her. I considered walking over, driven by an impulse that felt simultaneously foolish and exhilarating, but my feet remained rooted to the ground. I was struck by the inexplicable fear that if I left my covert perch at the edge of the cafe, something might fracture between us, like a spell unbroken. It was intoxicating, the way she seemed to exist outside time, and I risked another glance before succumbing to the waves of uncertainty that crashed within me. I wondered if she noticed me, the way I noticed her, a fleeting yet profound connection filled with all the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Hours later, as I tried to shake off the image of her sparkling eyes, they danced behind my eyelids every time I tried to sleep, her features weaving themselves into the fabric of my thoughts until it all felt inevitable. That night, I decided to return to the same cafe, believing that maybe, just maybe, chance would gift me a second interaction, a fleeting moment to bridge the divide between strangers. But when I walked through the threshold, the atmosphere paused, the cafe was relentlessly empty, and my heart sank deeper with each step. I searched frantically for her, the spell she had woven around my mind tightening with every passing moment, but she was nowhere to be found, the silence echoing my desperation. Maybe I was foolish to believe in the magic of coincidence, perhaps it was just a product of whimsy that would fade like the sunset. Days turned into restless nights consumed by thoughts of her, the images swirling until I started to feel, maybe, she was a figment of my imagination, conjured by a lonely heart. Yet, with each dusk, I returned, searching for a glimmer of that elusive connection. It felt like a tragic obsession, my yearning morphing into something darker. It all came to a head after a week of this maddening ritual. I thought I detected movement from the corner of my eye. There she was, seated apart from the usual patrons as if she were a queen in exile, still scribbling in that same journal, though the cafe was empty enough to amplify the quiet that surrounded her. I barely breathed, a mix of fear and ecstasy flooding my senses. I took one cautious step forward but halted in my tracks as something unnatural thrummed in the air. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted, her eyes bolted to me with an intensity that sent ice coursing through my veins, but instead of the bright connection I longed for, there was something ominous lurking within those depths, as if she was suddenly aware of a storm brewing in the distance. I felt indecisive, my heart raced for the chance to approach, but my instincts screamed at me to flee. Just then, The cafe door swung open, and the bright jangle of bells startled me. A man, scruffy and disheveled, stumbled through the entryway like he was drawn by an invisible string, his eyes wild and frantic. In that sliver of time, he locked onto the woman and charged toward her, shouting incoherently in a language that seemed twisted in anger. A chill cascaded through the room as I stood frozen. She recoiled at his approach, her expression shifting from one of surprise to bleak resignation. The moment tore at the fabric of reality, and as I willed my limbs to move, and it felt like running through molasses. The scruffy man reached her, his hands gesturing wildly. I could see her eyes, wide with an emotion I couldn't quite decipher, but in that instant, I glimpsed recognition wash over her face. This was no mere stranger, but someone forged from her past, an echo that had come back, threatening to shatter the evening's fragile peace. Just as I reached the brink of my resolve to intervene, she whispered something, but it was lost in the chaos of their confrontation. Then he lunged forward, and I finally broke the spell, rushing to them just as he grabbed her wrist with a force that made my stomach twist. "You can't escape this," he barked, but I was standard college kid, albeit with the energy of a cornered animal at that moment. I shoved him back, adrenaline surging. He stumbled but regained his footing, eyes glistening with a mix of fury and madness that terrified me more than his physicality. "Stay away from her," I shouted, the anger igniting something I didn't know I had. I could have fled, I could have left this just as a single haunting memory, but she wasn't just a passing thought anymore. She was everything. In that moment, we seemed intertwined, her gaze flickering between me and her assailant. Then something unexpected happened. She smiled just for me, a crack of light piercing through the chaos, and it fueled my fire. Without thinking, I shoved the man yet again, fueled more by instinct than rational thought, but this time he pinned me, jarring me into reality. "Let her go," I bellowed, my voice filled with urgency, but as I glanced over, her smile twisted into another forlorn gaze. "This isn't your fight," she pleaded, but I refused to listen, my pulse racing, emboldened by a drive I never knew I had. The man fell to his knees with a cry, releasing her wrist, and for an instant, the air felt charged, like electricity before a storm. But as the few patrons who had gathered murmured among themselves, something shifted within that man. He straightened up, an unsettling calm washing over him as his features morphed into something unsettlingly familiar. I watched in horror as his eyes glazed, an eerie smile spreading across his face as he slowly turned, locking eyes with me, and in that moment, his face morphed into what felt like a reflection of my own, warped and twisted in a mirror of dread. The cafe spun around me, and I found myself slack-jawed, paralyzed as the lines between our realities blurred. Suddenly, he broke into laughter, a sound that echoed like an accusatory dirge, and I felt the weight of that smile growing impossibly wide as he muttered, "You've drawn her in, haven't you?" Panic unfurled in my chest, reality felt thin, like it could tear at the seams. The woman I had been obsessing over, the one I felt could understand me, was no mere stranger, but a part of a more insidious web. The cafe faded into a void, dragging me into the unknown, where the promise of escape turned into an intricate trap, my obsession binding us together, each piece drawing tighter, closer to an unspeakable revelation that could change everything I thought I knew. In those suffocating moments, I could see her trapped within the layers of my mind, struggling to unearth the truth, but her face was becoming something unrecognizable, a flattened reflection of every fear I had ever felt. In a flash, it occurred to me that my fixation wasn't just a simple daydream but part of a darker narrative that tethered her existence to my own. The edges of time curved around us as we spiraled together, beckoning an unforgiving crescendo that threatened to consume us both whole, leaving behind nothing but shadows and echoes beneath a sterile gaze that watched from above, unseen but omnipresent, as if orchestrating a grand design that I alone could not alter. I lie to my parents about money so I can have a better life, but in the shadows of my deceit lies something far more sinister than mere white lies or harmless fabrications. You see, ever since I was a child, my parents instilled in me a fear of scarcity, imprinting upon my mind the belief that a lack of financial security would lead to a life of desperation. So when I enrolled in college, I knew I had to protect myself from this fear, even if it meant lying through my teeth. So I concocted a story about an internship that paid well, crafted a fake salary slip, and gradually, I became a master of deception, convincing my parents that I was thriving while actually racking up debt like a championship sport. But the real trouble began when my lies took on a life of their own, as I met Kelsey, a bright-eyed girl who seemed like the perfect antidote to my self-imposed isolation. She had this laughter that felt like sunlight, and in her presence, I found a foolish kind of courage, so I started to borrow money to take her out, convincing myself that I was merely investing in happiness, all the while penning elaborate excuses for why my phone bill was overdue or why I couldn't contribute to family dinners. But one night, as we lounged beneath the stars, hearts full with dreams and future possibilities, I let slip my supposedly lavish life. She looked at me, her eyes wide with awe, almost too trusting, and for a fleeting moment, I entertained the idea of coming clean, of laying my shame bare before her, yet the subsequent rush of shame felt too overwhelming, too engulfing, so I opened my mouth to speak and instead, I fabricated a story about a trust fund, my voice smooth as a new silk tie, and in her eyes, I saw admiration morph into something sticky, something that clawed at my insides with a haunting chill, rather than relief. Every incremental lie was a layer of ice that formed around my heart, slowly suffocating me, and still, Kelsey only drew me closer, romanticizing my false world until it became all-consuming. She asked about my family, prompting me to weave intricate tales of generous vacations and luxurious gifts, only for my mind to spiral further into a quagmire of deception that left me gasping for breath. And each night, when I returned to my empty dorm room and shed the counterfeit skin I had molded for her, I would slip into a despairing panic, pacing the floor while my endless financial struggles seeped deeper into the corners of my mind. But it got worse when my parents visited. Gleaming smiles plastered across their faces, they praised me for my successes, and the moment they handed me that stack of cash, intended for emergencies, my stomach dropped. In that single instance, I felt like I had swallowed razor blades, the blood-red truth slicing into my insides, but I just nodded, forcing a smile, desperate to protect this fragile illusion of happiness I had built, convinced that it would all fall apart if I dared to reveal who I actually was, and so I continued to lie, until one fateful day, Kelsey suggested that we host a dinner party, inviting my parents to meet her, and dread coursed through my veins like ice as I knew this would be a relentless test of my facade. I scrambled, shoving pieces of my life into a puzzle that barely fit, stitching together a fake home background, scrolling through my phone, pulling up pristine web pages that echoed my false world, and the dinner challenge culminated, laughter filling the air as Kelsey and my parents shared stories, their voices rising, painting vivid landscapes that felt so alien to me. Yet that evening turned towards darkness when my dad asked me about my job, his innocent question triggering a chain reaction of panic, leaving me grasping for answers, and as I stammered through rehearsed lines, Kelsey inadvertently slipped up, mentioning some acquaintance I supposedly worked with. This person existed only in the network of my lies, but at that moment, it felt as though I was dangling above the abyss, narrowly avoiding the plunge into the truth as my dad's brow furrowed, suspicion creeping beneath his cordial demeanor, and suddenly, I felt the thin veneer of successful kid fracturing beneath the probing weight of reality, slicing through me until everything snapped into jagged clarity, a blinding moment where I realized I was standing on the edge of a cliff, the crashing waves of consequence below patiently awaiting my fall. I rushed to spin the conversation, but the tightness in my throat grew unbearable, and just as I thought I might spill the truth and lay my shame bare, everything shattered when I heard a faint knock at the door. We all froze, glancing at one another before I reluctantly walked over, barely able to breathe as I opened it to reveal a tall man in a suit holding an envelope, the slight crease of concern on his brow igniting an electric charge of panic in my gut. "You owe us," he announced, standing there like an unyielding statue. And it felt like the ground dropped beneath me, a sharp realization wrapped around my insides, squeezing tighter than any lie could contain, and in that instant, everything unraveled as Kelsey turned pale, my parents' expressions shifted from curiosity to confusion, and there I stood at the center of it all, a web of lies and truths swirling around me, and in that dark moment, when I was stripped of my identity, my carefully curated facade melted away like ice in the sun, revealing the stark reality that my dreams of a better life had morphed into an insatiable monster that was now glaring at me, demanding its due, leaving me staring into the faces of the people I had deceived, horrified by the raw truth that sometimes a better life can come at a price we're not prepared to pay. For years, I struggled with an undercurrent of darkness that I labeled as depression, a vague specter that loomed over my daily existence, and as I searched for answers, I fell deep into the world of online forums where self-diagnosed mental health issues seemed like a badge of honor, where I began to lose track of what was real and what was merely a tapestry of others' experiences woven into my own. I read every post about anxiety, ADHD, and BPD, each tale laced with an unsettling familiarity that convinced me I must be drifting in the same troubled waters, and instead of seeking professional help, I found camaraderie in shared pain, wrapped in the comforting anonymity of usernames and avatars, learning the language of my supposed afflictions, how to express my anxiety with preciseness, and soon even my closest friends began to address me as that anxious one. Yet the weight of expectation was suffocating. Every time I hesitated to respond, every time I stumbled over my words, I felt like I was morphing into the very essence of what I claimed to be. In the depths of my spiraling identity crisis, something sinister began to emerge, an impulsive, shadowy urge to find a deeper connection, and one night, I stumbled across a post that described drenched feelings of despair, a kind of pervasive entity that the poster referred to as the Mind Reaper, claiming it could penetrate through your self-images and make you feel as though those self-diagnosed issues weren't just symptoms of psychological turmoil, but actual living demons that awaited every moment of weakness to latch onto. And as I delved deeper into his posts, I couldn't help but feel a chilling resonance with the way he described the Reaper, a paralyzing presence that curled around your consciousness, siphoning warmth until no shred of hope was left, making you feel as though your life was a grotesque performance staged for fleeting sympathies. And the more I read, the more I found myself living under the shadow of this phantom pain, wondering if perhaps, just perhaps, the separation I felt between my self-created persona and the truth of simply being human was the very thing that drew this dark entity nearer. Coincidentally, a few days later, upon returning home from a particularly draining therapy session where I finally admitted my obsession with self-diagnosis, I found an unmarked package on my doorstep. My heart raced as I stumbled inside, unwrapping it with trembling fingers to uncover an old mirror. The glass fractured in such a way that it fragmented my reflection into hundreds of glimmering shards, but nestled among the jagged edges was a hastily penned note that read, "The Mind Reaper walks just behind you, watching, waiting, this mirror is your truth." Confused yet compelled, I decided to place the mirror in my room, where it loomed ominously, feeling like a living thing. When I caught a glimpse of myself in its fragmented visage, I felt like I was staring into the abyss. Was that really me, or merely the assembly of all the pain I felt mirrored back as the pieces clinked like brittle glass? Days turned into weeks, every night shadowed by nightmares where the Mind Reaper's voice would taunt me, whispering secrets of my life, weaving in and out of reality, even pulling at the corners of my mind when I was awake, and I lost track of daylight as every evening I'd sit in front of the mirror and try to piece together my scattered self, only to feel the irrevocable loss of identity sink further, as if I'd willingly become a vessel for something larger than my own existence. On a particularly chilling night, when rain pelted against my window with a violent insistence, I couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was finally taking hold post-colliding revelations, and as I stared into the dark reflections of my own fractured psyche, my breaths caught in my throat when a formless shadow slinked behind me in the mirror, darkening the light until all I could see was the shimmering facsimile of my own terror etched back at me, and in that moment, I realized how truly fragmented I had become. All the pain, all the self-diagnosis boiled down to a single thread, and on the other side, the Mind Reaper stood relentless, a twisted specter hungry for my existence. But the irony hit me hard. I was no longer sure if I was the one afraid of this dark being or if I had become a mere puppet in its hands, lost in the chaos of my pursuits to sew together my true self from scraps of borrowed experiences. As months rolled forward, and the ties of reality unraveled into an elastic tether, I began seeing ripples of my anguish manifest around me. Friends distanced themselves, conversations fell flat, and my world turned grayscale, drowning in a sea of detachment. Yet still, I scoured the forums, feverishly seeking snippets of camaraderie with other self-diagnosed souls, hoping for guidance on how to defeat my unimaginable dark twin, all while my reality morphed into an insidious feedback loop, feeding off the wounds I was working so hard to ignore until finally, during a night of debilitating insomnia, I ventured online, my fingers a whirl of despair as I wrote one final post, a desperate plea for someone to understand, to tell me that I wasn't alone, that my mental health wasn't just a mockery spun from the threads of pain I absorbed like a sponge. When the screen flickered, capturing my attention, it was a reply from the original poster, the one who first introduced me to the Mind Reaper, and my heart sank as I read his words that sent a cold shiver down my spine. The more you feed your fears, the stronger the Mind Reaper becomes. It knows every secret, and it's hungry for more. I mulled over those words, feeling a sense of inevitability wash over me until I finally took the leap to confront my reflection once more, only to see him there, looming larger than life. He smiled, a twisted, insidious grin that stretched farther than I thought feasible, and in one last act of desperation, I shattered the mirror, each fragment a cry of recognition for the darkness I had allowed to tether my existence. But the moment the glass fell to the ground, an anguished wail erupted from the very heart of my torment, swirling up and consuming me, and as I succumbed to the darkness, I realized there was no escape. The Mind Reaper hadn't just become a part of me, it had devoured who I once was, leaving a hollow shell in its place. So, if you read this and find yourself caught in a similar web of fabricated identities, know this: Once you unravel that truth within, the mind reaper is a harbinger that grows stronger with every self-diagnosis. Be wary, for it waits to claim another victim, lured by the whispers of your tortured soul, until you're left with nothing but a mirror reflecting what you fear the most, the manifestation of every inadequacy wrapped in shadows, forever trapped within the confines of its malevolent gaze. It was supposed to be a carefree day hiking with friends, just a way to escape the mundane routine of life, but as I stumbled over an ancient route, I felt a jolt of pain shoot through my ankle that made me gasp, and although I sensed a deep twinge signaling something probably twisted or sprained, I didn't want to ruin the day for everyone, so I bit my lip and grinned, shrugging it off as just that, a harmless trip. I told my friends that I was fine, masking the agony roiling inside with a facade of bravery, and as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the forest floor, I focused on ignoring the discomfort while we continued our hike along the winding trails. Laughter echoed around me as we shared stories beneath the tall pines, the canopy shielding us from the impending dusk, but beneath my laughter was a growing anxiety, the nagging sensation that ignoring the injury might lead to something worse. When the day turned to twilight and we decided to turn back, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Soon, I'd be at home, ice on my ankle, wrapped in blankets and binge-watching my favorite series. The laughter quieted and I could see the path back winding in the dim light. So I took a deep breath and pushed through the fiery pain with every step, the adrenaline almost blinding me to the realization that my foot was slowly failing me, the ache buzzed like an electric current, pulsing through my limbs. Suddenly, the forest was alive with sounds, rustling in the bushes, something heavy moving just out of sight, and my heartbeat quickened, the thrill of the unknown mixing with my anxiety. I stumbled again and, in that moment of vulnerability, I heard something, a low growl resonating from the foliage, deep and guttural, a sound that sent prickles tingling at the back of my neck. My heart raced, blending panic with the thrill of adventure, but a sickening twist hit my gut. I wasn't alone. Crouching now and trying to peer through the leaves, I bit my lip hard enough to taste iron, suddenly understanding that the forest, once a sanctuary, had turned terrifying. The growl came again, closer, and as I pushed myself back up, the pain in my ankle intensified sharply, shooting through me like a lightning bolt. Panic flooded my system, and I rushed down the path, adrenaline and dread fueling my every move. My friends were ahead, their figures gleaming in the last light, but each step was sheer agony. My foot felt like it was shattering beneath me. I wanted to scream for them to wait, to help me, but I couldn't. The growl behind me urged me on, the fear dissipating rational thought, and instinct took over as I stumbled, falling to my knees, a searing pain coursing through my ankle. Just then, as my palms met the dirt, I heard a rustling that made my blood run cold. Whatever it was now almost upon me. Suddenly, I felt an urge to take one final look, to confront the terror that was lurking, so I twisted my body around, breath shallow and panicked, and there it was, a wolf, its eyes glimmering in the dark, inches away, muscles tensed, poised for whatever it was about to do. My heart hammered in my chest, and just as I thought the end was near, I realized, in its eyes flickered a glimmer of something else, something familiar. It was a tinge of fear, perhaps generated from my own panic. In that fleeting moment, I recalled the wisdom of my childhood, never show weakness to animals, so I steeled myself against the rising tide of terror. Perhaps due to my injured state or some primal instinct, I whispered, not words, but a low, calming sound, a lull of sorts, and astonishingly, the wolf buzzed. It tilted its head, as if trying to decode my essence, and in that split second, an otherworldly connection formed between us. Something inside me clicked. I realized that the very thing I had dismissed as a mere injury had, against all odds, saved me. I wasn't just any prey, I had shown my bone-deep flaws, my human fragility, and now the beast had retreated slightly. My friends finally reached me, calling out in confusion, and as they regrouped, the wolf simply turned, dissolving into the thicket as suddenly as it had appeared. The moment hung like an unshakable fog, wrapping around us as I sat there, trembling but unharmed, the pain in my ankle becoming a distant echo now that the threat had passed. Later, as we hobbled back to the car, I felt the weight of that encounter grafting itself onto my soul. I had faced primal fear and, somehow, I'd come through. My ankle did swell, and I ended up needing a brace for weeks to come, but I realized that the true injury had never been physical. It was the lie I spun to myself about being invincible and the desperate act of burying pain, an act that, in a twist of cruel irony, forced me to confront not just my limits, but the raw, visceral truth of vulnerability, the belief that embracing fear sometimes brings with it strange allies and reveals a fierce resilience I never knew I had. I am a compulsive liar, and have been my whole life. I should clarify that it's not the little white lies, like saying I'm busy when I'm really just watching TV. It's the monstrous, grotesque tales that twist reality around me until I can't even recognize myself. My earliest memories are soaked in deceit. I told my kindergarten teacher that my dad was a secret agent who saved the world on weekends, and instead of the laughs and playful ridicule I expected, her eyes widened with awe, and she called my parents in for a meeting to discuss their son's brilliant imagination. Suddenly, it became part of who I was, this charismatic facade I carefully crafted, and from that day on, truth became a mere tool for me to manipulate rather than a virtue to uphold. I continued spinning fables to maintain my persona. I boasted about living in penthouses and vacationing in Paris, painting a lifestyle that was richer than my family's meager existence, eventually convincing myself that I was one of the chosen ones, a protagonist in my own bright story, while ordinary life unfolded around me. As I grew older, I learned to use my lies to get places, college scholarships based on fabricated achievements, an internship secured by claiming experience I had on paper but never possessed. It was a rush, and I felt invincible. But the thrill was always tinted with a faint dread that seeped into my bones, whispering that one day I'd slip up and the weight of the truth would crush me. Then came the night of the accident. I was 16 and decided to attend a party I wasn't invited to, lying my way past the doorman with a convincing story about being a cousin of the host. I drank way too much, more than a kid should, and I felt untouchable until the moment the police arrived, lights flashing like unreal stars, and I sprinted through the crowd. I didn't notice the other guy until we collided, his body crumpling beside me, unconscious and bleeding. Initially, panic seized my heart, and I could hear my own breath anxious against my ears, but then something else washed over me, a cold euphoric detachment. I took off running, leaving everything behind, my friends, my lies, because ultimately, I was good at running. I made it home, and as the police search swept across the neighborhood, I concocted a sad tale about being home, locked in my room studying for a test. Mom believed me, surrounded by her illusions, and I convinced myself that it was a mere coincidence that the news would break about an anonymous boy left in critical condition, my guilt quickly overshadowed by an unrelenting need to escape before I was finally caught in the web of my own making. Months passed, my palms sweating at the thought that someone might see through my veil, and I immersed myself deeper into the lies, dictating my plans for a more glamorous life, and even lucked out with new friends whose lives were like mine, drenched in thrill and deceit. We shared secrets, exchanging stories where the truth had outstayed its welcome. We laughed about our past sins like they were badges of honor, but all I could feel was my heart racing under the pressure of the lies stacking higher and higher. It became impossible to see where I ended and the fabrications began. I turned into the hero of my own thrilling saga, until the cracks began to show. Returning home one night after a wild excursion, I walked into the living room only to find a police officer sitting across from my parents. An icy terror clutching my throat as I slid to a stop. The officer looked at me, and the air stilled, a storm of whispers bubbling in my mind. But then, he smiled grimly and said they'd found the son of a neighbor who had gone missing, the one I cursed myself for thinking about in that moment. I blinked, struggling to keep my composure, but I was horrified. A boy my age, dead. My throat dried out as echoes of my own life choices flashed before my eyes, memories of parties and reckless decisions where honesty could have saved me. I tried to convince my racing mind that my lies weren't affecting anyone else, but that night sliced through the mirage I'd built, forcing the shards of reality into my chest with each beat. Unacceptable guilt tangled with my ever-growing web, twisted like barbed wire, squeezing tighter. I had spent years mastering the art of illusion, but deception never felt this murderous. Days turned into weeks, a darkness settling over me, and I became distant from friends, losing them one by one as my guilt festered. They didn't deserve to be dragged down by a phantasm, and soon, I cut them off, retreating into isolation, drowning in my thoughts until memory returned once more, reminding me of the boy. The winking Polaroids fading in front of my mind's eye, the darkness shrouding my heart thickened, burdened with what I had avoided facing. The police did keep digging. I heard the whispers around school, the murmurs about how I had stumbled at that party, how I wasn't around when the fight broke out, and the walls I'd built were collapsing, brick by brick, trembling before my own version of truth. Eventually, someone put it all together, a classmate piecing an old rumor back to me, and suddenly I stood face to face with reality, the fragmented emotions clawing at me until finally, just as I thought I was about to drown in it, I spun yet another tale. I turned myself into the victim, the boy who nearly lost everything, painting myself in the light of righteousness while all along continuing to mold the lies around them until the day came when the officer came to my door again, This time the air was far heavier, filled with an oppressive silence as he informed me the boy's parents wanted answers. It took only a whispered moment for me to understand that they were convinced I had something to do with their child's death. Immediately, I swallowed back fear, preparing to recite my story like a mantra to shield myself from the truth, lying with fervor, but horrifically, as I spoke, a chill coursed down my spine as I glimpsed the officer's eyes. Something within them shifted, recognizing me, and in that instant, the weight of every fabricated word came crashing down around me, slashing through the veil of safety I had wrapped around myself for years. I was no longer just a liar, I was their enemy. Each sentence turned to ash in my mouth as I realized my facade laid bare before the law, and my heart hammered with the terrifying sound of betrayal, knowing that the very person I sought to deceive now measured my worth in hushed whispers. I felt the deepest irony take root in my core. I was a liar, but in those moments when the truth chased me down, I understood the soul-crushing weight of what lay beneath. The unthinkable truth that engulfed my life was the body of the boy I had left behind, and with my lies trapped in a cycle of turmoil, I knew there would be no way out without facing the consequences, no escape from the shadows of my past. As the truth finally caught up. 2 hours ago, I found myself in a grimy corner of a gas station, heart racing from both the caffeine and the realization that I had just become an unwilling participant in a hostage situation. The stench of stale coffee mixed with the faint scent of cigarettes was suffocating as I watched a man, his face jagged with desperation and anger, point an unsteady handgun directly at me from behind the counter, his other hand clutching a crumpled paper bag filled with cash. I remember my thoughts racing. I should have just filled up my tank and left, but I was frozen with fear, my instincts screaming at me to run, to hide. Time blurred around me, the sunlight outside fading into a surreal, muted glow as I tried to decipher what to do. I tightly grasped the chipped edge of the counter, feeling like I was about to topple over, when deep down, I felt this overwhelming urge to defuse the situation instead of fleeing. I don't know why I felt that, but somehow, I found the courage to speak, to calm him down. "Hey, man, it's all right. Just breathe. You don't have to do this," I said, voice trembling but steady. He flinched at my words, his eyes darting with confusion and something softer, a glimpse of humanity before it was swallowed by desperation. For a brief moment, it felt like I was standing in a vacuum, the world and its noise shrunk away as I looked directly into his haunted gaze, and I could see him, just a man who had hit rock bottom instead of a monster with a gun. In a moment of raw courage, or perhaps sheer insanity, I stepped closer, which made the man jerk back, his finger twitching dangerously by the trigger. "I can help you," I continued, my voice low but firm, inching even closer to the edge of the counter. "It doesn't have to end like this. There's got to be a better way. Just talk to me." I don't know what possessed me to put myself in such danger, but somehow, I saw that flicker of understanding in his eyes again. Behind the grime and desperation, he was just a man, scared and hopeless. I saw a flash of pain that bridged the gap between us, and in that heartbeat, he lowered the gun, confusion stamped across his face. It was as if he was slowly waking from a nightmare. He looked around, the realization of what he was doing crashing down upon him. The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, and I could see the panic begin to sprawl across his features. I didn't mean to," he stammered, but before he could finish, I heard the unmistakable howl of police cars pulling into the lot. The man twitched with fear and suddenly, adrenaline surged within him, pulling the gun back towards me, this time with a fully realized intent. "Get the hell out. This is your fault," he shouted, and without thinking, I dove for him, grabbing his wrist and twisting, hoping to distract him long enough for the police to make their move. My mind was swirling, and in that split second, adrenaline propelled me as I managed to knock the gun from his hand, the weight of our bodies crashing into the floor as I wrestled to restrain him. Chaos erupted, the sound of yelling, the shattering of glass, and the rush of footsteps as law enforcement swarmed in, handcuffs clicking around his wrists just as my heart began to slow. I'll never forget the look in his eyes as he was taken away, a mix of anger and gratitude. I had saved him from whatever darkness had driven him to that point, yet in my heart, I felt disgusted by the whole ordeal. The hero in the movies doesn't have to tackle his would-be murderer to the floor, he just stands tall, claiming his victory. I expected that moment would fill me with hope, but as I left that gas station, adrenaline still pumping through my veins, dread washed over me, particularly when I glanced at the time. I've always been a night owl, but as the stars flickered into existence, I felt an uneasy tingle down my spine, as if something loomed in the shadows just beyond my vision. I decided to take a long way home, turning on the radio in a futile attempt to shake off what happened and its lingering grip on my mind. Just a few blocks from home, I stopped at a red light and felt an instinctive chill crawl across the back of my neck as if I wasn't alone. I looked into my rearview mirror upon feeling those eyes boring into me, and there, in the darkness, was the outline of a figure standing by the entrance to a convenience store. It was him, the man from the gas station. Our eyes connected, and though it was only a fraction of a moment, the haunting memory surged back, panic clawing at the edges of my thoughts. Screams erupted in my mind. I thought that maybe he would just fade away like a character from a bad dream, but he didn't. Those tired, hungry eyes remained fixed on mine, his glare burning with an intensity that sent a surge of cold terror through me. The light changed, and I pushed down on the gas pedal, just wanting to put distance between us. My breaths quickened as I turned corners, heart racing as paranoia kicked in, shadows mingling with the darkened streets. I was about to let down my guard when suddenly, my phone rang, a sharp break in my fevered daze, and seeing my mother's name flashing across the screen momentarily distracted me. I answered shakily, managing to tell her I was all right, but the call felt like a strange farewell. As I hung up, I glanced out my window again, and dread hardened my gut. The man was there, now mere feet away, following my car with a kind of keen focus that made my skin prickle with sharp apprehension. The moment our eyes met again, something shifted behind that look. I could see the wheels turning in his mind, an idea forming. Instead of running away in fear, I dared to breathe. Perhaps there was still a shred of humanity left in him. "Please," I found myself whispering, "don't do this." I had saved his life once, and all I wanted was to keep my own. I tried to convince myself that I had witnessed his potential, that perhaps he could change, yet as he stepped closer, with each relentless approach my fear twisted into something darker. I drove faster, weaving through the fog of the night, but every time I glanced at my mirror, he was right there, a haunting specter filled with unyielding purpose. His persistence unnerved me until I could hear my own heartbeat drumming alongside the thrum of my thoughts. What the hell does he want from me? The streets twisted and turned into an inescapable labyrinth, and just when I thought I'd lost him in the layers of darkness, the realization hit. I could feel a surge of cold rage, sharp and bitter, spread through me, a furious conclusion that I was not the hero of the night, but rather just a pawn in whatever twisted game he had in mind. I made a rash decision, turning into a nearby alley where my heart pounded heavy in my chest, praying I'd find somewhere to hide or perhaps even lose him in the serpentine aftermath of my reckless driving. But just as I pulled to a stop, his figure loomed in my peripheral vision, devastatingly close. I let out a shaky breath, stumbling out of the car, adrenaline coursing through my veins, a desperate force pushing my feet into action. This was not how my night was supposed to end. I should have felt relief after leaving that hellish gas station, but now, the air was thick with fear, every step I took giving life to a growing sense of dread. The shadows danced around me, mocking me, as I glanced over my shoulder to see him round the corner, his presence no longer merely a reflection of my past but a palpable entity closing in, lurking in the darkness. Just seconds turned into an eternity, my heart racing faster than my thoughts could grasp, fear gripping me like a vice as I stumbled backward and stumbled right into the wall. I could see the glint of something metallic glimmering in his hand, a blade. And at that moment, I realized I was not just in danger, I had awakened something inside him, a monster awakened by my act of kindness, opposed to the heroism I had imagined. My thoughts spiraled as I recalled the terrified look in his eyes just moments before the police restrained him. He was no longer the shaken man clinging to the precipice of sanity. Instead, I was staring into the abyss of his rage, a feral intensity that threatened to consume us both. I thought of my reckless choice to help him, of the night I dragged him back and had quelled the ominous storm. In that instant, it became painfully clear that whatever spark of humanity I thought I had glimpsed was long gone, leaving behind only the void that made him lethal. When he lunged at me, I barely reacted, my mind suffocated by terror as I fumbled for anything to defend myself, and suddenly our roles became clear. I was now the prey while he was the predator. But that's when instinct kicked in, and I found a rock beneath my feet, hoisting it toward him with what strength remained, smashing it against his head before pushing past him and sprinting into the night, not daring to look back despite the shouts that echoed behind me. I ran in frenzied bursts, unable to predict where I was going, only that every inch brought me further from the weaponless shell that barely survived 2 hours ago. The sounds of footfalls were like thunder roaring behind me, threatening to consume me whole, propelling me through darkened streets, adrenaline coursing through every fiber of my being. I don't know how long I ran, pushing my legs beyond their limits until I finally found the scent of life, neon lights in the distance, a welcome sanctuary of movement amidst the encroaching darkness, fueled with hope that I'd find refuge within the arms of other people. When I stumbled into that diner, breathless, shaking, I expected to feel relief wash over me, but all I felt was the weight of the night bearing down, every ounce of that fear coiling tightly around my throat. The staff and patrons looked at me, bloodied, wild-eyed, as if I were a ghost materializing from a nightmare no one could fully comprehend. I tried to explain, to form coherent words amidst the panic, but when the sirens blared just beyond the windows, my words faded into gasps, fear overpowering me entire. As the police barged into the diner, searching, I felt the trembling reality: he was out there, somewhere in the shadows, and I had unknowingly opened the door to chaos that would haunt me eternally. When they found me, I was clutching a salt shaker like a weapon, feeling foolish yet scared, and perhaps I reminded them of someone who had lost themselves right before their eyes. They took my hands and recounted the night, assuring me they would protect me. But deep inside, I knew that my savior had turned hunter, and no matter how many nights I spent in safety, the monster's rage lingered on the edges of my mind. I had saved a man's life, and in return, he had taken mine, weaving us both into a twisted reality where nightmares are born from the very flecks of humanity we hope to hold on to. My son is a freshman in high school and frequently oversleeps, missing his bus, and I get so mad at him for this, but what unnerves me the most is what he says about his dreams, the strange, vivid nightmares that seem to linger even in the daylight hours, whispering through the cracks of our home. Just 3 weeks into the school year, he missed the bus for the second time, and I stormed into his room, ready to unleash the frustration I had been bottling up for too long. Yet, when I saw him there, tangled in his sheets, sweat glistening on his forehead, I felt a twist of concern wrap around my anger. "Don't you care about school? What's wrong with you?" I shouted, the words coming out sharper than I intended. He stirred, squinting at me, eyes clouded with a disoriented fear I didn't understand. "Mom," he replied in a whisper, "it's not the bus, it's the dreams." As he recounted them, my heart sank. He talked about a man in the shadows, tall and impossibly thin, with fingers like spider legs that reached out towards him, scraping at his soul. I could see the fear pooling in his eyes, and while I wanted to dismiss it as typical teenage over-exaggeration, something in his voice made my skin prickle. The man, he said, was relentless, ushering in a collapsing world where echoes of forgotten monstrosities taunted him in twisted reflections of our home. I brushed off his fears, thinking it was just stress from the transition to high school, but over the next few weeks, my son continued to oversleep, and his grades started slipping. Even worse, he would wander through our house in a daze, mumbling about the man with the long fingers and how he could feel him pulling him back into the dream, weaving a darkness around him that was starting to invade our waking life. I tried grounding him, taking away his phone, and even seeking advice from a doctor, but nothing changed. Then one night, just after he'd missed yet another bus, I heard noises coming from his room, like muffled cries or soft thuds, and I hesitated before knocking. When I finally twisted the knob and opened the door, I was met with an unsettling sight. He was standing in the middle of his room, eyes closed, face contorted in fear, his hands waving about as if he were fighting something unseen. "Get out!" he screamed suddenly, and I took a step back, my stomach dropping as I realized he wasn't talking to me. "He's right behind you!" he shrieked, and I felt the air grow thick with an almost palpable dread. I hesitated, caught between instinct and terror, and before I could make a move, he collapsed, silencing the room. Terrified, I rushed to him, checking for a pulse, trying to ground him in reality as I called for help into the nothingness. Days turned into weeks, his mind becoming a battlefield between wakefulness and haunted dreams, each night more harrowing than the last, all while I helplessly watched my son slip away. I devised a plan, thinking perhaps if he faced the man in his dreams, it would empower him. Little did I know how wrong that would go. That night, I placed a recorder next to his bed, hoping to capture his nightmares for us to dissect together in daylight, convinced that knowledge would shed light on the darkness. But instead of clarity, I heard the chilling entities spill from his lips as he slept, words too dark to understand, curses and urgent warnings about the dangers of dreams should one dare to cross the threshold. When I listened back, I felt an uncanny presence wash over me, squeezing at my heart as the screeching rasp of the man echoed in the night. Each morning, I would find him deeper in the clutches of those twisted dreams, with fewer and fewer lucid moments, and that's when I began to see the changes in the house. Shadows darting just beyond the corner of my vision, items displaced, and the feeling of something waiting just outside our realm. I finally sought comfort from a local folklore expert who spoke of dream realms and entities that fed off fears, suggesting a ritual to release my son from the grip of this dream taker. With reluctance but desperate hope, I followed her instructions. I lit candles, burned sage, and called his spirit to fight back while he slept. Just as I finished, a sound broke the silence. "Hello," rumbling laugh that sent chills down my spine. I ran to his room, finding it empty, the only evidence of his presence being the broken recorder splayed in pieces on the floor, and that's when I noticed the dark figure standing in the doorway, the skin stretched tight against the bone, fingers long and twisting like branches reaching for answers. Heart racing, I shouted for my son, but the entity only stepped closer, its breath foul, filled with whispers that clawed at my sanity. I felt a surge of parental instinct and lunged forward, but it was almost a tangible wall of darkness that forced me back, planting me against the wall, breath stolen, watching helplessly as two blank holes stared straight through me. I finally found my voice, realizing in desperation that the man hadn't just been a dream, he was here, binding my son in chains forged from nightmares. Just as hope dimmed, a figure erupted into the room, my son's voice charging back from the depths. He chanted words I didn't recognize but felt powerful, and with every syllable, the atmosphere shifted, the figure recoiled, screeching as it faded back into the shadows. And then silence. My son collapsed again, this time still, and I rushed to him, wrapping my arms around him more to hold on to sanity than comfort. After a moment, he stirred, groggy but present, and when he opened his eyes, there was something darker lurking beneath. He didn't speak of the dream or the figure or what had truly happened, he only murmured, "I'm sorry, Mom, for everything." I brushed the guilt away, wanting to assure him it would be all right, but the distance in his gaze spoke volumes about what we had unleashed and lost. I soon discovered that my son wasn't the only one waking up each day with shadows lingering just behind his eyes. As days turned bittersweet, I realized the man might not let us go so easily, and I learned that every morning when I wake him up for school, I'm battling more than just his reluctance to rise. I'm battling the silence in my home that grows heavier with each sunset, and the chilling realization that my son's freshman year might turn out to be not just the beginning of adolescence, but rather, a descent into a nightmare from which we may never truly awaken. I never thought that my summer vacation would take such a disturbing turn, but there I was, staring at the small bottle of lube sitting on the edge of my bathtub, the sunlight glinting off its tacky surface as if it were mocking me. The discovery felt like unearthing a sinister secret that shouldn't exist in the same house I had grown up in, and I felt a queer mixture of embarrassment and dread practically seep through my pores. The house I shared with my father was supposed to be my sanctuary, a place filled with memories of long-forgotten childhood games and the laughter of summer barbecues, not a crypt where cringe-worthy secrets could bludgeon my perception of him. It all started innocently enough. I had just come home after a long day spent with friends, relishing the thought of a warm shower and a well-deserved break from my chaotic teenage life. Flicking open the bathroom cabinet to fetch my shampoo, my fingers collided with something else long before I found what I was looking for, and that's when I spotted it, a bottle of lube so embarrassingly out of place, sitting there like a rogue artifact from a world I didn't want to think about. My mind raced, a floodgate of hypothetical situations crashing against the shores of logical reasoning. Was this for him? Or was it for someone else? I could feel bile creeping up my throat at the thought of my dad, the man whose stern but loving demeanor had shaped my very reality, indulging in the sticky allure of intimacy that I couldn't even begin to fathom for him. It gnawed at my thoughts, images of him fumbling awkwardly, or even worse, confidently flaunting this in the dim light of a room where my own childhood innocently resided, feeling like a dagger slicing through my naivety. I could hear my heart pounding, the rhythm of anxiety clamoring louder than my reason, echoing against the tiled walls, demanding to know how I could possibly reconcile this gut-wrenching revelation about my father's private life and the father who took me fishing and taught me how to ride a bike. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up the bottle, almost in disbelief. The label was generic, a no-frills kind I might have brushed off in another context, but now, with all these thoughts swirling in my mind, it felt like it screamed of secrets I wasn't meant to know, like some twisted version of a spell that had unlocked a door I was never meant to open. I put it back, almost angrily, forcing myself to look away and focus on something, anything, else. But there was no distraction that could silence the insidious questions forming in my mind, moments replayed like loops in my head, fragments of memories blurring together, shared glances, unspoken words, those small, awkward pauses we often brushed aside as mere silence but now felt laden with meaning. How could I unsee this? How could I pretend I'd never found it, that I wasn't hyper-aware of every nuance in his behavior? The way he laughed a little too loudly at his own jokes. Or the small, transient smiles that didn't quite meet his eyes when he thought no one was watching. The entirety of our relationship began to feel like a fragile structure built on the illusion of understanding, and panic surged within me as I grappled with the fear that this might change everything. I made the desperate decision to confront the situation head-on. The anxiety coiled inside me, and my read out every single notion of what normal was slipped through my fingers like grains of sand. Later that evening, I casually, almost too casually, brought it up. We were sitting on the couch, the scent of acorn squash filling the air as he pretended to watch yet another bland TV show. My voice almost quivered as I forced the words out, using humor to cloak my discomfort. "Hey Dad, you left some personal items in the bathroom, like, lube? Pretty sure it's not mine." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. His eyes widened, shifting from the screen to meet mine, his brows narrowing as he pieced together what I was intimating without saying more. The room thickened with something unspoken, a tension that twisted in my gut, and within that span of seconds, I could see a shadow descend over his features, remorse or embarrassment marring his usually composed demeanor. Sputtering, he finally cleared his throat. He started, his voice cracking a bit, it's not what you think." But the panic was already radiating from him, cluing me in that perhaps this was indeed exactly what it sounded like. Those words hung in the air, vibrant and horrifying, glistening like the bottle on the tub, and I suddenly felt an unbearable wave of embarrassment wash over me. I could only stare at him, waiting for some kind of explanation to break free from his lips, feeling the weight of my naivete crash on me as bitter, salty fear drained into my stomach. Well, he stammered, running a hand through his graying hair, looking surprisingly vulnerable. "Some things got messy," he said finally, avoiding my gaze. "Things changed after the divorce." My heart sank, it felt as if the floor had dropped beneath me, and I was caught in a long, spiraling descent into a void that knocked the breath out of me. All those uncertain times, the late nights he spent alone after my mother moved out, so lost in his own world, I'd thought he was just adjusting, but now it felt much darker. Suddenly, I was forced to reckon with the idea of him being more than just my dad. He was a man grappling with the aftershocks of a broken life, one desperately seeking connection where he might find it, and all at once, I felt like a voyeur peering into the unsettling parts of his existence that had no place in my view. There was a quiet sadness in his eyes that mirrored my own turmoil, but instead of anger or resentment, I felt a deep ache of empathy that sent my thoughts spiraling anew, wondering how long he'd been alone, who he had turned to, and what those encounters meant for him now. A damning silence filled the space as he processed this bombshell dropped between us. I felt as if I'd crossed a line into a territory I could never uncross, and while a part of me wanted to laugh it off or dismiss it, I couldn't shake the growing unease twisting like barbed wire around my heart. Was I forever altered by this revelation? Would our relationship ever recover from this freshly painted layer of intimacy that had been thrust upon us like an unwanted guest? The next day crept by. I walked through the motions of my routine, the weight on my shoulders growing heavier, every memory I shared with my dad now tainted by that single, external object that had forced its way into our world. It felt like a ghost haunting the everyday moments we shared, and when I heard his voice from the kitchen, laughter ringing through the air, it felt like a hollow echo, one that resonated with a newfound dread, as if it were mocking my efforts to pretend like everything was normal. I stumbled through my day like a living, breathing shadow, the smile plastered on my face feeling more and more like a mask, while my thoughts were chained by that simple truth: my dad was not just my dad, he was a man carving out his own broken pieces in search of solace. And with every passing second, I knew I could never see him the same way again. In the dark of the night, I curled up in bed with the unyielding churning in my gut, the silent heaviness of it all wrapping around me like a vice, suffocating the remnants of innocence I thought I still possessed. As sleep tugged at the edges of my consciousness, I could have sworn I felt the shadows whisper secrets in the corners of my mind, urging me to consider the unthinkable, that life itself was a tangled web of discomfort, that even those we love most can surprise us with the layers of their existence, and that nothing, even the laughter in my dad's voice, could ever be trusted to stay the same. I only hire cute girls or ugly guys at the college job I work, which might sound shallow, but I promise there's a reason for it. The campus coffee shop where I manage after classes isn't just a pit stop for caffeine, it's a breeding ground for something much darker, a place where beauty and awkwardness clash in ways that can only be explained through the bizarre experiences of the last 2 years. At first, it was innocent enough. I'd bring in a rotation of pretty girls hoping to catch the eye of someone or the awkward boys struggling to find their place in the social hierarchy. But then strange things began to happen. Certain regulars started to vanish, seemingly swallowed by the very air that filled the coffee shop, and the ones who remained developed eerie obsessions with our staff. The turning point was when Mia, a bubbly freshman with a smile that could light up a room, began to work shifts alongside Simon, a gangly guy with braces and a penchant for a cappella singing. The chemistry between them was palpable, but as their odd friendship blossomed, things began to unravel. Late at night, while cleaning up after closing, I'd hear whispers almost as if the shadows wanted to spill their secrets, but when I turned around, there was nothing, only the walls soaked in the sweat and laughter of stressed students and late-night study sessions. I shrugged it off until Mia didn't show up for her shift one rainy Thursday, a day when the storm was just loud enough to drown out my growing anxiety. I closed up early, thinking she might be sick or just trying to avoid the unpredictable weather. The next evening proved worse. Simon, anxious and jittery, was the only one manning the counter. He told me he hadn't seen Mia in 2 days, and the sinking feeling in my gut twisted tighter. The customers were acting strangely too, the appealing folks staring too long into the barista's eyes, intent as if they could suck something out of them, something human. I tried to dismiss it as paranoia, but I couldn't shake the feeling that with every new worker, a cute girl or an ugly guy, the shop blurred the lines of something sinister. Then came the night I saw the first signs of what I now know was the beginning of the end. I returned from the back room to find Simon speaking earnestly with a group of girls at the counter, their laughter wafting through the air thick with the smell of burnt espresso. One girl, with hair like molten gold and a radiant smile, kept glancing towards the entrance as if waiting for someone that would never walk through that door again. I should have stepped in, should have ended the facade right then and there, but curiosity gnawed at me, holding me in place. The laughter turned thick and indistinct, twisting into something darker, and in the next moment, Simon had begun to tremble. I thought he was just nervous, but soon his eyes were wide, pupils dilating as he stared off into the room's dim corners. It was then I felt it, a chill slithered up my spine, crawling like fingers reaching for my heart, dark shadows pressing in, and I finally understood, the whispers weren't mere figments, they were real. I needed to check on Mia. I rushed to her apartment, hardly thinking about what lay ahead. When I arrived, the door swung open easily, the hinges squeaking, revealing a scene I wish I could unsee. The room was empty save for a crumpled notebook lying face down on the floor. I picked it up, my heart racing. It contained Mia's thoughts on everything, the coffee shop, the friends she had made, and even a strange passage about an entity spiriting people away, a creature that fed on the essence of beauty and anxiety. My breath hitched in my throat, my mind raced, trying to piece it all together, trying to convince myself it was a delusion. I hurried back to the coffee shop, fearing for Simon and the others. The shop was quiet, the lights flickered as if the walls themselves sensed impending doom. When I reached the back, I found him standing rigid, staring at the wall, mumbling something about the door and the end. Panic flooded me. I pulled him away, demanded he look me in the eyes, but he just kept saying, "You can't look away, they'll come for you if you do." Suddenly, I felt it, a heavy presence looming, suffocating. It was there, creeping in from the shadows, and only then did I understand the terrible cycle. We lost a worker, and now the shop demanded another. Before I could react, Simon was pulled to the side, twisting away from me, his eyes wild with fear. He screamed as something unseen snatched him from reality. I stumbled back, terror gripping me tight as I clawed for the light. The door was my only escape, but as I turned, I glanced back at the counter one last time, and I saw it, a shape, hauntingly beautiful yet horrifying, eyes as dark as pits and a smile that promised nothing but despair. There were whispers, seductive and luring, promising joy and delight, but all I felt was the grasp of night fragments consuming everyone I dared bring into the fold. I tore from the shop, bursting into the chilled night, and even now, this very moment, I can still hear the echoes of laughter mingled with screams, a reminder that my choices had given life to a predator only satisfied with beauty and loneliness. I don't work there anymore, I can't, but one thing remains: next semester, when the new hires come in, I'll still feel that haunting presence breathing down my neck, always waiting, always hungry. It started with one night of reckless abandon, the kind of night that felt like a neon-lit fever dream, where reality twisted into a blurry mess of laughter and intoxication. I didn't even know her name when we stumbled into my apartment, the air thick with vulnerability and bravado, as we shed our inhibitions along with our clothes. We both knew where it was headed, the magnetic pull of primal instincts overshadowing even the smallest shred of common sense, and when the early morning sunlight began to creep through my window, leaving taco trucks and late-night bars in the rearview mirror, I fully expected that would be the last I'd ever see of her, but then I received a text 3 weeks later that turned my life into a waking nightmare. "I'm pregnant," it read, and even though I had never met a baby trapped, The world pressed in on me so hard that I could hear my heartbeat ricocheting off the walls like a frantic pinball. For a moment, my mind went blank, the panic a tight coil in my chest. I was 26, fresh out of grad school, working a dead-end job in a coffee shop, living with my parents while trying to pay off student loans. I had neither the time nor the resources to welcome new life into such chaos. I tried to reach for rationality, for a way out, but my bravado slipped away like water through seeping cracks, and all I could feel was the suffocating weight of impending responsibility. We met that weekend in a diner, with its flickering neon lights and greasy menus that felt like a cruel joke, as she stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, and I realized she was just as lost as I was. We spent hours fumbling through awkward conversations and half-hearted jokes, but the laughter couldn't cut through the thick fog of anxiety that hung over us, and when she finally said she was thinking of keeping it, my heart collapsed under the weight of dread. Images of sleepless nights, baby cries, and shattered dreams flooded my mind. The thought of us felt like a ghost trapping me, suffocating any chance of freedom or happiness, manifesting a deeper panic. In a moment of desperation, I suggested she consider other options, words woven together with fear and desperation that sent a chill through the diner, mingling with the greasy scent of fries. She left in tears, and I felt a pang of guilt mix with relief as we went our separate ways, her not knowing where I had just trapped myself, lost in the shadows, resonating echoes of my own decisions haunting me. The next few weeks were a blur of manic existence, trying to avoid her calls, dodging text messages, and deceiving myself into thinking that maybe, just maybe, I could live this life unscathed, like running from a nightmare that kept unfurling in the recesses of my mind. But it didn't stop. Out of nowhere, I grew sick during the nights, not from the anxiety of what awaited but from something deeper and darker, a sensation that felt more like a presence, tightening around my throat like a slow strangulation, and when I finally sought help, the doctor looked into my eyes and said, "There's nothing physically wrong, but maybe you're just stressed out." And so the weeks dragged on, with my existence narrowing into the oddly cozy confines of my own panic, watching shadows dance on the walls, feeling like a prisoner in my own skin, as I realized I was disappearing, fading with each yawn, each ounce of energy slipping away like dust in the wind, reducing me to nothing more than a wisp, a ghost of who I once was. The night I changed felt particularly vivid. I looked in the mirror and saw it, the hollow cheeks, the sunken eyes staring back at me, but now it wasn't just a reflection, it was as if someone else was staring back, a stranger peering from behind the glass, and I barely registered the pounding on my door until it shattered my trance. Before I could react, before the panic could turn into a response, a violent crash sent splinters across the floor, and there she was, the girl from that fateful night, her face twisted in anger and desperation, red and raw like she had clawed her way through a thorny bush. "I needed to tell you," she gasped, and before she could complete her thought, a shudder crawled down my spine, and I knew she wasn't alone. I was swallowed by darkness, the door collapsing, pushed aside, and there it was, the presence I had suffocated beneath my panicked thoughts, standing behind her, an amalgamation of shadow and texture, as if distorted memories rolled into one sepulchral being, and I realized too late that it wasn't just my fear manifesting. As the silhouette expanded like smoke curling into the room, it filled the space with an icy dread radiating from nowhere and everywhere, echoing like a forgotten despair, and a frantic energy surged within me to run, but my legs felt like concrete. It was a horrifying truth, I was trapped within my own demise, like I had become both the phantasm and the prisoner, witnessing my life slip away as if I were spectating in a theater of the damned. "What's happening?" she screamed, while a light trembled against the onslaught of shadows, and I wanted to shout, to tell her to run, but my voice was lost between realms, trapped like I was, fated and fating. I watched helplessly as the creature reached for her, the rejection of destiny played out in Casablanca tones, fear brewing as she shrieked, and the last visible remnants of life I possessed swirled into the abyss, where the lines of mortality and spirit blurred. I felt it in that moment, the truth that settled in, that I had strived to escape and now welcomed with open arms, a realization that I had become truly a ghost, wandering the earth, forever shackled by my own choices, encircled by my demons while the living blinked and danced around me, unaware that I could only watch, freezing in horror as life unfolded without me, trapped not by a baby, but by the weight of my own regrets as I drifted along the edges of darkness. I was 14 when my dad remarried, and at first, I thought having a stepmom might be fun. She seemed nice enough, always bringing me little gifts and smiling her way into my life. But as soon as the honeymoon phase wore off, things took a dark turn. My stepmom, Lydia, was obsessed with appearances, and not in a healthy way. The first time she mentioned hair, I was in the bathroom, brushing my teeth, and she poked her head in, her smile plastered on a face that always felt like it was holding back something sinister. "You know, darling, if you just let a little more grow, you'd look so much more mature," she said, her eyes glinting like shards of glass. I laughed it off, thinking she was joking, but that was just the beginning. As weeks passed, she began to push me harder. She filled our bathroom with creams and potions that she insisted would enhance my natural beauty. I complied, thinking it was just a phase, but when she began to shave patches of my hair off and coax me into embracing the fuzz blossoming around my chin, I started to feel trapped. "You're so beautiful as you are," she would say, but it never seemed sincere. My friends began to notice the strange hair growth, whispering behind my back at school, and I felt shame like I had never known. One day, as I sat on the edge of my bed, trying to figure out how to tell my dad, Lydia entered, holding a thin razor and grinning madly. "It's time to take it to the next level, sweetheart," she coaxed, and I froze, every cell in my body screaming for me to run. It was then that I realized the hair wasn't just her obsession, it was something darker. With every stroke of the razor, my reflection morphed into some grotesque version of myself. I became the living embodiment of Lydia's twisted ideals, the hair thickening, curling, until what remained of my identity faded like summer light. My room grew quiet, the once comforting glow of posters and knickknacks distorted by Lydia's chaotic energy. My dad had no idea, the man he loved was too enchanted by her facade, oblivious to the darkness clouding his daughter's existence. I started to withdraw from everyone outside my home, the glares and jeers at school replaced by muffled conversations in dark corners. Then came the day she brought home a strange little old woman. Lydia introduced her as Clara, her facilitator, whatever that meant. Clara's eyes glittered like feral jewels as she surveyed me, and for the first time, I felt like a specimen under glass, my humanity dissected in their minds. "We're just helping you embrace your true self," she cackled, her voice reminiscent of dead leaves scraping the asphalt. The following weeks were a blur of humiliation, each morning marked by terrifying silences filled only by the buzzing of clippers and the scent of unnatural oils. I didn't just have a beard, I felt as if I were being groomed for something much more sinister. Knowledge that I couldn't fully grasp loomed menacingly in the corners of my mind. I finally confronted my dad one fateful evening, the words tumbling out in a chaotic mess as I begged him to listen. "Lydia's crazy, I'm not this person, I don't want to be this," but the words fell flat against the rigid lines of his shirt as he turned away, dismissive. "She loves you, you need to accept her guidance," he replied, and that was when I lost it, ranting, spewing out my anguish until there was nothing left but the hollow ache of a daughter desperate for her father's recognition. Slowly, the gravity of my life pressed down harder, and I found myself sneaking away to the library, hiding between the rows of dusty tomes, searching for something to latch onto, a sense of self that seemed unreachable in my own home. One rainy evening, as I thumbed through a book on folklore, I stumbled across tales of shape-shifting creatures that could take human form but hid secrets beneath the surface. The parallels unraveled in my mind, and I saw Lydia's true nature. She wasn't just a woman, she was something other than human, using my femininity as a vessel for whatever dark agenda she thrived on. That realization pinched my heart with fear but infused me with a strange courage. I wouldn't let her bend my will any longer. That night, as the storm howled outside, I lay in bed, plotting my escape. In the days that followed, I gathered my strength, watching her every move, learning all the things she missed about me. I would appear obedient, the dutiful daughter in her eyes, while secretly waiting for the moment she revealed the full extent of her ambition. The opportunity came when she announced a small ritual, "Just the three of us," she said, "to solidify our family bond." I barely slept that night, thinking of Claire's mocking laugh. As Lydia prepared her bizarre array of candles and odd herbs in the heart of the living room, a tremor of dread shook my resolve. When she began chanting in a low, guttural voice that resonated with something primal and dark, I knew this was it. My chance. I sprinted to the kitchen, clutching a knife tightly, the metallic taste of adrenaline spurring me on as I returned. But when I swung it at her, slicing through the space between us, she flinched but did not scream. Instead, her eyes ignited with an unspeakable rage, and the air grew thick with tension. "You think you can escape, child? This isn't just about appearances, it's about power," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom, and the room spiraled into chaos as Clara cackled like a maniac, raising her hands, twisting the shadows. In that moment, it dawned on me, she wasn't just my stepmom, she was stealing pieces of me, weaving them into some dark tapestry that would make her powerful, all while using my identity against me. I plunged the knife into the altar of herbs she had so meticulously laid out, a desperate effort, and as it shattered in a burst of light, the room erupted around us. Lydia's facade peeled away, revealing a shadow creature, and Clara, transformed into a wraith, screaming violently as the darkness enveloped them both. I stumbled back, horrified and yet liberated, as their forms disintegrated into wisps of shadows carried away by the wind. The next morning, I woke up to an empty house, the weight of my beard somehow gone, and with it, the invisible strings that once bound me to their grotesque quill. I wandered into the sun, feeling the softness of my face, my identity, encapsulated in the warmth of my skin. My dad never spoke of Lydia again. It was as if she had never existed, but I knew better. I had glimpsed the darkness lurking beneath the surface of our lives, and I would carry that knowledge with me. I found my voice again, and though the scars of my experience would stay, I had reclaimed not only my identity but my place in the world, and that was worth everything. I never thought that lying about my job would come back to haunt me, but here I am, covered in sweat and fear, trying to figure out how it spiraled so far out of control. It all started when I met Lisa at a housewarming party. She was stunning, the kind of woman who seemed to radiate a light all her own, her laughter infectious. I desperately wanted her to notice me, to see me as someone worth her time, so when she asked what I did for a living, I panicked and blurted out that I was a historical data analyst specializing in archaic technologies. The look on her face was priceless. She was impressed, and I reveled in the attention, my charade becoming a thrilling game as I watched her interest in me grow, but I was treading on dangerous ground. The next week, she asked me to meet at a local cafe where she wanted to introduce me to her friend, a history professor who taught ancient civilizations, and my heart dropped into my stomach. There was no way I could back out of this now, so I just lied through my teeth, casually dropping technical jargon as if I lived and breathed it. To my immense shock, they seemed to truly buy it, and just like that, I was pulled deeper into my own web of deception. The more we hung out, the more I had to fabricate, conjuring elaborate stories about my research trips to ancient ruins that only existed in my imagination. I felt an exhilarating high, but it was laced with a creeping dread. Then came the day I received a text from Lisa asking if I'd help her organize a panel discussion at her university. Her professor friend thought I'd be a perfect guest speaker. My heart raced in panic, but I could hardly say no without crashing the entire facade I'd built. I spent the next few sleepless nights researching historical terms and facts, preparing myself for the inevitable moment I had to stand in front of a crowd and pretend to be someone I wasn't. When the day arrived, I walked into the auditorium, adrenaline pumping, eyes starting nervously. There were dozens of students seated, and I could see Elisa beaming with pride. It was time to act. I stood at the podium, the microphone in front of me feeling like a noose tightening around my throat. I began speaking, weaving a tapestry of lies so intricate that, for a moment, I almost believed my own junk. Each compliment, each nod of understanding from the audience made me feel invincible, but behind the facade, the tendrils of anxiety were wrapping around my heart tighter with every passing moment. Just as I was almost in the groove of my false narrative, a hand shot up in the back, and I was met with the icy glare of a stern-looking man who introduced himself as Dr. Palmer, a leading archaeologist with a sharp reputation for debunking frauds, and my blood ran cold as he asked me to clarify a term I had just used. In that moment, I was frozen, words escaped me, and I realized that I had stepped into a pit filled with alligators, and even though I had the instincts to claw my way out, I didn't even know which way to turn. Dr. Palmer leaned in, pressing me further, the students around me shifting in their seats, the tension palpable, and just when I thought I might implode, Lisa spoke up, trying to rescue me with her charm, battling the aggressive barrage of questions, but my heart sank as I realized I was dragging her into my lie, too. I felt sick, knowing I had thrust her into the chaos of my deception, and just as I considered the possibility of simply fleeing the stage, the fire alarm unexpectedly blared, sending everyone into a panic. It was a chaotic cocktail of relief and dread, making my heart pound as we were ushered outside. But instead of escaping, I found myself cornered by Dr. Palmer, who pulled me aside and whispered fierce accusations of dishonesty and ignorance. With sweat trickling down my neck, I braced myself for the storm, and before I could muster any form of plausible denial, he leaned in closer and said something that turned my world inside out. "You think you're the first? They're watching." My eyes widened in confusion, and before I could ask who he meant, he pulled back to survey the crowd flooding the campus grounds. I glanced over my shoulder, and my heart dropped into my stomach as I caught sight of a group of people in dark coats, standing ominously beneath an ancient oak tree, their eyes fixed on me. They looked like something out of a nightmare, long faces, expressions twisted with dark amusement, and with each person I recognized, my throat grew tighter. They were a group connected to the very archaic technology I had only pretended to know about. Fear flashed through me as I realized I hadn't just fabricated a job, I'd caught the attention of something much darker, something that existed outside the bounds of reality as I knew it. My mind raced with panic as the crowd began to disperse, but something about those people lingered, like shadows that wouldn't fade. I knew I had to disappear, to run from this tangled web of lies before it swallowed me whole, but running meant abandoning Lisa, who deserved someone real, someone good in her life, rather than the ghost of a man woven from lies. And before I knew what I was doing, I took off into the night, knowing full well that my fabricated job, once a ticket to her heart, had become a doorway to a haunting I never signed up for, and as I sprinted away, I could still feel those eyes watching me, hungry for the truth. I thought I could escape, but every night since, every time I glance over my shoulder, I feel them lurking, their whispers echoing in the recesses of my mind, a reminder of the twisted game I played, the moment when I took a leap into a world of darkness, and instead of letting go, it gripped tighter, until I can no longer tell the difference between who I was, who I pretended to be, and what terrible price I will eventually pay, haunted not just by my choices, but by the very shadows of the lives I so carelessly constructed and tore apart in an effort to find love. For more years than I care to admit, I've been silently battling a personal demon, a relentless obsession with alcohol that began when I was just a teenager, mingling with the wrong crowd at parties, pretending I was invincible, floating on the high of spirits that distorted my reality and twisted my perception of relationships. It became a crutch I leaned on too heavily, the nights blurring together under a haze of slippery memories, regret filling the spaces between the laughter of friends. As I grew older, I found myself slipping deeper into the abyss. Friends were lost, bruised relationships shattered under the weight of my dependency, until I finally made a choice. I resolved to quit. But quitting meant facing the world, social situations, and a gnawing sense of isolation without my beloved poison, so I hatched a plan, a disguise I thought could veil my recovery from the people I still drank with. Instead of ordering a vodka soda or whiskey neat, I'd simply request water, the ultimate sleight of hand, while carrying on conversations as if nothing had changed. Gradually, it became second nature. I would show up at bars or parties, a water bottle in my hand, and no one suspected a thing. They laughed, they toasted, and I felt glimmers of pride that I was keeping my promise to myself, all while appearing comfortable, even social, but the weight of my secret piled onto my chest like boulders on a bridge, threatening to crush me at every turn. But the truth is, I didn't just stop drinking alcohol, I started replacing it with something much darker. As weeks turned into months, my friends grew accustomed to the sight of my water bottle, chuckling at my new healthy lifestyle and dismissing my absence from the bottom of bottles with playful nudges. What they didn't realize was that with each sip of water, I was filling the gaps in my life with something far more sinister. I became increasingly obsessed with eavesdropping on conversations, reading lives like books, each toast and laugh amplifying the echoes of my own misery. I'd watch their eyes light up when they let loose, not realizing I had started a different kind of addiction, one to their secrets, to the imprints of their realities painted out in blurred half-truths as they spiraled into drunkenness. The stories spilled so easily in the late-night hours, revelations that flowed as freely as the alcohol, and as I swirled my water bottle contemplatively, I began cataloging not just their stories, but their vulnerabilities, the partner who cheated, the dream job they lost, the hidden traumas nestled deep in their pasts, becoming a twisted curator of their souls. It thrilled me at first, a sense of power over them that soothed the frayed edges of my own self-worth, but with power came consequences. As the night wore on and lanterns flickered in smoke-filled rooms, I noticed strange changes, sometimes in their eyes, a flickering recognition that felt unsettling, as if they could peer through my facade and glimpse the voyeuristic intrigues that had taken root in my heart. How, I wondered, could they possibly detect the predator behind the charming mask? Then came that fateful night at Sam's birthday party. The music thumped like a pulse and the room crackled with laughter. I sat in the corner, nursing my familiar water, continuing to observe and record little pieces of their lives, when I overheard the unmistakable sound of tears mingled with laughter. It was Sarah, the quietest one of the group, confiding in Mark about her abusive ex, her words ragged and raw. Something shifted inside of me, a need to protect her bloomed, tangled with the roots of my own pain and the desperate urge to drown my loneliness in her vulnerability. As the evening progressed, I approached Sarah under the guise of offering her a refill, my heart racing before I even spoke. "Hey, you okay?" I gestured towards the slightly crumpled paper cup in her hands, the one that had been tightly cradled, trembling under the weight of emotions she struggled to articulate. Suddenly, it felt different, a line crossed. This wasn't just eavesdropping anymore, it was involvement. Yet, part of me relished it. I wasn't just an observer, I was now a participant in their stories. I watched her face as I comforted her, listening intently, but in the corners of my mind, paranoia took hold, whispering that my own secrets were just beneath the surface, a dark veil that threatened to slip. Later, as I shifted back to my half-empty bottle, the air hung heavy with unwelcome tension. I noticed Mark watching me, his expression darkening. "You're not drinking, right?" He chuckled, but there was something wrong in his tone, something chilling that sent a shiver dancing up my spine. I laughed it off, but I could feel a chill radiating from his gaze, as if he knew I was collecting pieces of them, feeding off their brokenness. It spiraled at night, as I faced the music of their trust. I couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom thrumming beneath my skin. I heard fragments of whispers and felt eyes linger on me, unsettling and accusing, piercing my protective facade. In the blink of an eye, the mood shifted. Sarah had a drink too many, her laughter turned into a sobbing fit, hurling her truths into the void, all while I collected secrets overflowing like the alcohol we had danced around. I watched in horror as from the corner of my eye, Mark grabbed me, pulling me away from the group, his grip iron around my wrist. "You need to stop hiding, man," he muttered as I protested, an edge of urgency slicing into his words. "What do you mean?" My stomach notched at his accusation. "You, with your water, we all see it. You think you're clever, but you're just preying on our pain." The words hit harder than any bottle ever had, the whispers in my head erupted into a cacophony. My heart raced as I realized the damning truth, that I had been so focused on their vulnerabilities that I had failed to acknowledge my own rotting core. I fumbled for words, desperate to defend myself, but with every denial, the weight of guilt pushed me deeper into the shadows of my own making. That night unraveled like a thread pulled too tight, the very connections I'd thought I'd forged now fraying. I couldn't look Sarah in the eyes anymore, nor face the interrogative glare of Mark. I felt their betrayal slicing through my very soul, stripping away any remaining threads of trust that bound us together. Before I knew it, my facade collapsed under the weight of their accusations, and with it, my morale sunk like a stone, slipping away into the darkness I had been so desperate to escape. I fled that night, leaving behind the cacophony of laughter and tears, the curious glances of friends who thought they knew me but had barely scratched the surface of my unraveling. And in the days that followed, their calls blurred into distant echoes, and as silence enveloped me, the weight of isolation crashed over me like a tidal wave. I spiraled down, losing myself once again to the quiet allure of forgetting, this time cloaked in shame. I started injecting my life with substances even more damaging than the alcohol I had sworn off, seeking solace but finding only further despair. Days became weeks, and then nothing but a blur laden with regret until the memory of that party felt like a phantom, a distant storm I thought I could escape from. But now, as I write this, I realize I can't outrun the truth I buried so deep, the trust I shattered. It haunts me with every sip of water, taunts me with every casual encounter, a remnant of the life I constructed on whispers. I watch the world through the glass of the bottles I long to touch, while the voices of my friends murmur in the back of my mind. I didn't just swap whiskey for water, I swapped connection for isolation, pouring my life down the drain, laughing at the fragility of their truths that I hoarded like trophies. And now, as I sit alone in this unending abyss, I wonder what has become of the friends I abandoned, their stories still swirling somewhere in the ether, while I drown in the most intoxicating truth of all, the one haunting me day by agonizing day, that I destroyed the only good connections I had in favor of manipulating their pain. I've been smoking crack on and off for a few weeks now, and while I know it's messed up, I can't shake this feeling that it's not just the drug altering my perception, something darker is slipping into my reality. It all started innocently enough, you know? Just a way to escape the relentless grind of a dead-end job and a failed relationship that I had been stewing in for too long. At first, it was a little hit here and there, a way to temporarily float above the suffocating weight of my existence, but then, as these things often go, I started to crave it more. I didn't think it could get worse than when I lost my job. I had that oh-so-familiar rock-bottom moment where you stare into the abyss and tell yourself it's just a phase. But one night, on a whim, I invited this guy named Kevin, a friend of a friend, over. I'd heard he could get good stuff, and at that time, I was dying for an escape. As the smoke curled and danced around us, I felt my skin tingle, the walls melting away like an ice cube in the summer heat. For a few hours, everything was euphoric. Days turned into nights, my sense of time became a mere suggestion, and before I knew it, I was lost in a haze of endless high that spun deeper and deeper into a chasm of paranoia and dread. Waking up became increasingly harder. I look in the mirror and barely recognize the ghost staring back, shadows under my eyes telling me I hadn't seen sunlight in days. I started hearing whispers, little things really, like the TV playing even when it was off, or the faint sound of laughter echoing in my empty apartment. It was easy to brush it off at first. After all, my mind was running on fumes, dancing dangerously close to madness. But then one night, everything changed. I just hit that peak, and as I floated into my high, the whispers became clear, forming words that made my heart race. "Help us," they said, chillingly coherent. I blinked hard, questioning my sanity. Surely this couldn't be happening. I looked around the room, expecting Kevin to jump out and laugh at the prank, but he was gone. As usual, having slipped into the shadows like a specter. Shaking it off, I tried diving deeper into the haze, but the voices persisted. Fractured syllables of "find us" echoed ceaselessly in my mind, relentless as the high faded, and I could no longer disregard it as mere hallucination. The next day, I found myself in a stupor, replaying those words, and I couldn't help but entertain the idea that perhaps something or someone needed me, needed help. After the ecstatic high wore off, the sobering weight of reality loomed over me like a thunderous cloud. It had been nearly a week since I last saw anyone, so I reached out to Kevin. What I got instead was a number unfamiliar, a soft-spoken voice that sent shivers down my spine as it asked, "Are you ready to hear our story?" The drumming in my chest quickened. I wanted to hang up, I wanted to say no, but I couldn't utter a sound. The voice continued, "You've unlocked the door that has been shut for so long, but you may not like what you find." I thought about it, envisioning the void I was existing in, and spoke through trembling lips, "What do you mean?" There was a pause, an eerie stillness. Then a soft chuckle, and just like that, he repeated, "You've been smoking crack on and off for a few weeks, do you really understand the price of that?" I thought back, everything began swirling in gears. "What price?" I demanded, panic rising. And then I heard it, an unmistakable melody creeping from my kitchen, a teasing lull that seemed to beckon, harmonizing beautifully with the whispering voices. "Find us," it sang sweetly, luring me from the depths of my despair. I stumbled towards the sound, convinced I was losing my grip on reality, but I had to know. Curiosity clawed deeper than any drug ever could. Gripping the doorknob, I turned it, feeling every drop of sweat drip down my back, and I found my kitchen glowing, as though lit by thousands of fireflies. There in the corner, shadows twisted into shapes, children dancing, laughing, their expressions blissfully innocent yet tinged with something sinister. And their voices overlapped, blending into one chilling hum, "Help us! Help us!" I tried to scream, but the high had carved my throat into stone, and then I understood, they didn't just need help, they wanted me to join them. The whispers, the children, they were lost souls, addicts trapped in some vengeful purgatory, and here I was, the unwitting key to their freedom. "You're just like us," the soft voice from the phone continued, "just another lost soul in this never-ending cycle." I stepped back, every instinct screaming to flee, yet their smiles captivated me, drawing me into a spiral of horror I could hardly fathom. I turned to run, desperate to escape this waking nightmare, but something strange happened. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, the kitchen door slammed shut, locking me inside. The children became frantic, their laughter twisting into wails, and suddenly I was bombarded by visions of their stories, a torrent of anguished memories flooding my mind, tragic endings, lives lost in addiction, moments of weakness that condemned them to replaying this macabre dance. I was no longer in control. Their pain, their joy, their despair washed over me like a tide, pulling me down into depths I never imagined. I thrashed against the door, pounding my fists until they bled, but the voices grew louder, drowning out my screams with their collective sorrow. "Join us! Join us!" they cried, and as desperation set in, the truth gnawed at me. The drug had opened my mind to a reality I never wanted, and in my search for escape, I had just stepped into the haunting embrace of the very darkness I thought I could outrun. In that moment, I was no different from them, lost, trapped, pleading for something I could no longer understand. As my vision blurred and the laughter crescendoed into a final, deafening roar, everything blackened, and I realized the whispers were right. I had been smoking crack on and off for a few weeks, but now the crack had smoked me,